KPTERSEVEN. The Bolshevik Party in the period of preparation and realization of the October Socialist Revolution, April 1-9-1-7-1-9-1-8. 1. Situation in the country after the February Revolution. Party emerges from underground and passes to open political work. Lenin arrives in Petrograd. Lenin's April theses. Party's policy of transition to socialist revolution. The course of events and the conduct of the provisional government daily furnished new proofs of the correctness of the Bolshevik line. It became increasingly evident that the provisional government stood not for the people but against the people, not for peace but for war, and that it was unwilling and unable to give the people peace, land or bread. The explanatory work of the Bolsheviks found a fruitful soil. While the workers and soldiers were overthrowing the Tsarist government and destroying the monarchy root and branch, the provisional government definitely wanted to preserve the monarchy. On March 2, 1917, it secretly commissioned Guchkov and Shulgin to go and see the Tsar. The bourgeoisie wanted to transfer the power to Nicholas Romanov's brother, Michael. But when, at a meeting of railwaymen, Guchkov ended his speech with the words, "Long live Emperor Michael," the workers demanded that Guchkov be immediately arrested and searched. "Horseradish is no sweeter than radish," they exclaimed indignantly. It was clear that the workers would not permit the restoration of the monarchy. While the workers and peasants who were shedding their blood making the revolution expected that the war would be terminated, while they were fighting for bread and land and demanding vigorous measures to end the economic chaos, the provisional government remained deaf to these vital demands of the people. Consisting as it did of prominent representatives of the capitalists and landlords, this government had no intention of satisfying the demand of the peasants that the land be 181 turned over to them. Nor could they provide bread for the working people, because to do so they would have to encroach on the interests of the big grain dealers and to take grain from the landlords and the kulaks by every available means. And this the government did not dare to do, for it was itself tied up with the interests of these classes. Nor could it give the people peace. Bound as it was to the British and French imperialists, the provisional government had no intention of terminating the war. On the contrary, it endeavored to take advantage of the revolution to make Russia's participation in the imperialist war even more active, and to realize its imperialist designs of seizing Constantinople, the Straits and Galicia. It was clear that the people's confidence in the policy of the provisional government must soon come to an end. It was becoming clear that the dual power which had arisen after the February Revolution could not last long, for the course of events demanded the concentration of power in the hands of one authority. Either the provisional government or the Soviets. It was true that the compromising policy of the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries still met with support among the masses. There were quite a number of workers, and an even larger number of soldiers and peasants, who still believed that the Constituent Assembly will soon come and arrange everything in a peaceful way, and who thought that the war was not waged for purposes of conquest, but from necessity to defend the state. Lenin called such people honestly mistaken supporters of the war. These people still considered the socialist revolutionary and Menshevik policy, which was one of promises and coaxing, the correct policy. But it was clear that promises and coaxing could not suffice for long, as the course of events and the conduct of the provisional government were daily revealing and proving that the compromising policy of the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks was a policy of procrastination and of hoodwinking the credulous. The provisional government did not always confine itself to a covert struggle against the revolutionary movement of the masses, to backstairs scheming against the revolution. It sometimes attempted to make an open assault on the democratic liberties, to restore discipline, especially among the soldiers, to establish order, that is, to direct the revolution into channels that suited the needs of the bourgeoisie. But all its efforts in this direction failed, and the people eagerly exercised their democratic liberties, namely, freedom of speech, press, association, assembly and demonstration. The workers and soldiers endeavored to make full use of their newly won democratic rights in order to take an active part in the political life of the country, to get an intelligent understanding of the situation and to decide what was to be done next. After the February Revolution, the organizations of the Bolshevik Party, which had worked illegally under the extremely difficult conditions of TSRdom, emerged from underground and began to develop political and organizational work openly. The membership of the Bolshevik organizations at that time did not exceed 40,000 or 45,000. But these were all staunch revolutionaries, steeled in the struggle. The party committees were reorganized on the principle of democratic centralism. All party bodies, from top to bottom, were made elective. When the party began its legal existence, differences within its ranks became apparent. Kamenev and several workers of the Moscow organization, for example, Rykov, Bubnov and Nogin, held a semi-Menshevik position of conditionally supporting the provisional government and the policy of the partisans of the war. Stalin, who had just returned from exile, Molotov and others, together with the majority of the party, upheld a policy of no confidence in the provisional government, opposed the partisans of the war, and called for an active struggle for peace, a struggle against the imperialist war. Some of the party workers vacillated, which was a manifestation of their political backwardness, a consequence of long years of imprisonment or exile. The absence of the leader of the party, Lenin, was felt. On April 3, 1917, after a long period of exile, Lenin returned to Russia. Lenin's arrival was of tremendous importance to the party and the revolution. While still in Switzerland, Lenin, upon receiving the first news of the revolution, had written his Letters from Afar to the party and to the working class of Russia, in which he said, "Workers, you have displayed marvels of proletarian heroism, the heroism of the people, in the civil war against TSK. You must now display marvels of organization of the proletariat and of the whole people, in order to prepare the way for your victory in the second stage of the revolution." Lenin, selected. Works, Volume 6, page 11. Lenin arrived in Petrograd on the night of April 3. Thousands of workers, soldiers and sailors assembled at the Finland railway station and in the station square to welcome him. Their enthusiasm as Lenin alighted from the train was indescribable. They lifted their leader shoulder high and carried him to the main waiting room of the station. There, the Mensheviks Chikadze and Skobelev launched into speeches of welcome on behalf of the Petrograd Soviet, in which they expressed the hope that they and Lenin would find a common language. But Lenin did not stop to listen. Sweeping past them, he went out to the masses of workers and soldiers. Mounting an armored car, he delivered his famous speech in which he called upon the masses to fight for the victory of the socialist revolution. "Long live the socialist revolution," were the words with which Lenin concluded this first speech after long years of exile. Back in Russia, Lenin flung himself vigorously into revolutionary work. On the morrow of his arrival he delivered a report on the subject of the war and the revolution at a meeting of Bolsheviks, and then repeated the theses of this report at a meeting attended by Mensheviks as well as Bolsheviks. These were Lenin's famous April theses, which provided the party and the proletariat with a clear revolutionary line for the transition from the bourgeois to the socialist revolution. Lenin's theses were of immense significance to the revolution and to the subsequent work of the party. The revolution was a momentous turn in the life of the country. In the new conditions of the struggle that followed the overthrow of TSK, the party needed a new orientation to advance boldly and confidently along the new road. Lenin's theses gave the party this orientation. Lenin's April theses laid down for the party a brilliant plan of struggle for the transition from the bourgeois democratic to the socialist revolution, from the first stage of the revolution to the second stage, the stage of the socialist revolution. The whole history of the party had prepared it for this great task. As far back as 1905, Lenin had said in his pamphlet, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, that after the overthrow of TSK the proletariat would proceed to bring about the socialist revolution. The new thing in the theses was that they gave a concrete, theoretically grounded plan for the initial stage of the transition to the socialist revolution. The transitional steps in the economic field were nationalization of all the land and confiscation of the landed estates, amalgamation of all the banks into one national bank to be under the control of the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, and establishment of control over the social production and distribution of products. In the political field, Lenin proposed the transition from a parliamentary republic to a republic of Soviets. This was an important step forward in the theory and practice of Marxism. Rheticians had regarded the parliamentary republic as the best political form of transition to socialism. Now Lenin proposed to replace the parliamentary republic by a Soviet republic as the most suitable form of political organization of society in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. The specific feature of the present situation in Russia, the theses stated, is that it represents a transition from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed the power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to the second stage, which must place the power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest strata of the peasantry. Ibid. Page 22. Not a parliamentary republic. To return to a parliamentary republic from the Soviets of Workers' Deputies would be a retrograde step, but a republic of Soviets of workers, agricultural laborers and peasants' deputies throughout the country, from top to bottom. Ibid. Page 23. Under the new government, the provisional government, the war continued to be a predatory imperialist war, Lenin said. It was the task of the party to explain this to the masses and to show them that unless the bourgeoisie were overthrown, it would be impossible to end the war by a truly democratic peace and not a rapacious peace. As regards the provisional government, the slogan Lenin put forward was, "No support for the provisional government." Lenin further pointed out in the theses that our party was still in the minority in the Soviets, that the Soviets were dominated by a bloc of Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, which was an instrument of bourgeois influence on the proletariat. Hence, the party's task consisted in the following. It must be explained to the masses that the Soviets of Workers' Deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government, and that therefore our task is, as long as this government yields to the influence of the bourgeoisie, to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the errors of their tactics, an explanation especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses. As long as we are in the minority, we carry on the work of criticizing and exposing errors, and at the same time we preach the necessity of transferring the entire power of state to the Soviets of Workers' Deputies. Ibid. Page 23. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. This meant that Lenin was not calling for a revolt against the provisional government, which at that moment enjoyed the confidence of the Soviets, that he was not demanding its overthrow, but that he wanted, by means of explanatory and recruiting work, to win a majority in the Soviets, to change the policy of the Soviets, and through the Soviets to alter the composition and policy of the government. This was a line envisaging a peaceful development of the revolution. Lenin further demanded that the soiled shirt be discarded, that is, that the party no longer call itself a Social Democratic Party. The parties of the Second International and the Russian Mensheviks called themselves Social Democrats. This name had been tarnished and disgraced by the opportunists, the betrayers of socialism. Lenin proposed that the party of the Bolsheviks should be called the Communist Party, which was the name given by Marx and Engels to their party. This name was scientifically correct, for it was the ultimate aim of the Bolshevik Party to achieve communism. Mankind can pass directly from capitalism only to socialism, that is, to the common ownership of the means of production and the distribution of products according to the work performed by each. Lenin said that our party looked farther ahead. Socialism was inevitably bound to pass gradually into communism, on the banner of which is inscribed the maxim, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Lastly, Lenin in his theses demanded the creation of a new international, the Third Communist International, which would be free of opportunism and social chauvinism. Lenin's theses called forth a frenzied outcry from the bourgeoisie, the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries. The Mensheviks issued a proclamation to the workers which began with the warning, "The revolution is in danger." The danger, in the opinion of the Mensheviks, lay in the fact that the Bolsheviks had advanced the demand for the transfer of power to the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. Plekhanov in his newspaper, Yedistvo, Unity, wrote an article in which he termed Lenin's speech a raving speech. He quoted the words of the Menshevik Shikadze, who said, "Lenin alone will remain outside the revolution, and we shall go our own way." On April 14 a Petrograd City Conference of Bolsheviks was held. The conference approved Lenin's theses and made them the basis of its work. Within a short while the local organizations of the party had also approved Lenin's theses. The whole party, with the exception of a few individuals of the type of Kamenev, Rykov and Pyatakov, received Lenin's theses with profound satisfaction. 2. Beginning of the crisis of the provisional government. April Conference of the Bolshevik Party. While the Bolsheviks were preparing for the further development of the revolution, the provisional government continued to work against the people. On April 18, Milikov, Minister of Foreign Affairs in the provisional government, informed the Allies that the whole people desire to continue the World War until a decisive victory is achieved, and that the provisional government intends fully to observe the obligations undertaken towards our allies. Thus the provisional government pledged its loyalty to the Tsarist treaties and promised to go on shedding as much of the people's blood as the imperialists might require for victorious finish. On April 19 this statement, Milikov's note, became known to the workers and soldiers. On April 20 the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party called upon the masses to protest against the imperialist policy of the provisional government. On April 20–21, May 3–4, 1917, not less than 100,000 workers and soldiers, stirred to indignation by Milikov's note, took part in a demonstration. Their banners bore the demands: publish the secret treaties, down with the war, all power to the Soviets. The workers and soldiers marched from the outskirts of the city to the center, where the provisional government was sitting. On the Nevsky Prospect and other places clashes with groups of bourgeois took place. The more outspoken counter-revolutionaries, like General Kornilov, demanded that fire be opened on the demonstrators, and even gave orders to that effect. But the troops refused to carry out the orders. During the demonstration, a small group of members of the Petrograd Party Committee, Bagdatiev and others, issued a slogan demanding the immediate overthrow of the provisional government. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party sharply condemned the conduct of these left adventurers, considering this slogan untimely and incorrect, a slogan that hampered the party in its efforts to win over a majority in the Soviets and ran counter to the party line of a peaceful development of the revolution. The events of April 20–21 signified the beginning of the crisis of the provisional government. This was the first serious rift in the compromising policy of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. On May 2, 1917, under the pressure of the masses, Milikov and Guchkov were dropped from the provisional government. The first coalition provisional government was formed. It included, in addition to representatives of the bourgeoisie, Mensheviks, Skobelev and Tsereteli, and socialist revolutionaries, Chernov, Kerensky and others. Thus, the Mensheviks, who in 1905 had declared it impermissible for representatives of the Social Democratic Party to take part in a revolutionary provisional government, now found it permissible for their representatives to take part in a counter-revolutionary provisional government. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries had thus deserted to the camp of the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. On April 24, 1917, the 7th April Conference of the Bolshevik Party assembled. For the first time in the existence of the party, a Bolshevik conference met openly. In the history of the party, this conference holds a place of importance equal to that of a party congress. The All-Russian April Conference showed that the party was growing by leaps and bounds. The conference was attended by 133 delegates with vote and by 18 with voice but no vote. They represented 80,000 organized members of the party. The conference discussed and laid down the party line on all basic questions of the war and revolution, the current situation, the war, the provisional government, the Soviets, the agrarian question, the national question, etc. In his report, Lenin elaborated the principles he had already set forth in the April Theses. The task of the party was to effect the transition from the first stage of the revolution, which placed the power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to the second stage, which must place the power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest strata of the peasantry. Lenin. The course the party should take was to prepare for the socialist revolution. The immediate task of the party was set forth by Lenin in the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." The slogan, "All power to the Soviets," meant that it was necessary to put an end to the dual power, that is, the division of power between the provisional government and the Soviets, to transfer the whole power to the Soviets, and to drive the representatives of the landlords and capitalists out of the organs of government. The conference resolved that one of the most important tasks of the party was untiringly to explain to the masses the truth that the provisional government is by its nature an organ of the rule of the landlords and the bourgeoisie, as well as to show how fatal was the compromising policy of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks who were deceiving the people with false promises and subjecting them to the blows of the imperialist war and counter-revolution. Kamenev and Rykov opposed Lenin at the conference. Echoing the Mensheviks, they asserted that Russia was not ripe for a socialist revolution, and that only a bourgeois republic was possible in Russia. They recommended the party and the working class to confine themselves to controlling the provisional government. In reality, they, like the Mensheviks, stood for the preservation of capitalism and of the power of the bourgeoisie. Zinoviev, too, opposed Lenin at the conference. It was on the question whether the Bolshevik Party should remain within the Zimmerwald alliance, or break with it and form a new international. As the years of war had shown, while this alliance carried on propaganda for peace, it did not actually break with the bourgeois partisans of the war. Lenin therefore insisted on immediate withdrawal from this alliance and on the formation of a new, communist international. Zinoviev proposed that the party should remain within the Zimmerwald alliance. Lenin vigorously condemned Zinoviev's proposal and called his tactics arch-opportunist and pernicious. The April conference also discussed the agrarian and national questions. In connection with Lenin's report on the agrarian question, the conference adopted a resolution calling for the confiscation of the landed estates, which were to be placed at the disposal of the peasant committees, and for the nationalization of all the land. The Bolsheviks called upon the peasants to fight for the land, showing them that the Bolshevik Party was the only revolutionary party, the only party that was really helping the peasants to overthrow the landlords. Of great importance was Comrade Stalin's report on the national question. Even before the revolution, on the eve of the imperialist war, Lenin and Stalin had elaborated the fundamental principles of the policy of the Bolshevik Party on the national question. Lenin and Stalin declared that the proletarian party must support the national liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against imperialism. Consequently, the Bolshevik Party advocated the right of nations to self-determination even to the point of secession and formation of independent states. This was the view defended by Comrade Stalin, in his report delivered at the conference on behalf of the Central Committee. Lenin and Stalin were opposed by Pyatakov, who, together with Bukharin, had already during the war taken up a national chauvinist stand on the national question. Pyatakov and Bukharin were opposed to the right of nations to self-determination. The resolute and consistent position of the party on the national question, its struggle for the complete equality of nations and for the abolition of all forms of national oppression and national inequality, secured for the party the sympathy and support of the oppressed nationalities. The text of the resolution on the national question adopted by the April Conference is as follows. The policy of national oppression, inherited from the autocracy and monarchy, is supported by the landlords, capitalists and petty bourgeoisie in order to protect their class privileges and to cause disunity among the workers of the various nationalities. Modern imperialism, which increases the striving to subjugate weak nations, is a new factor intensifying national oppression. To the extent that the elimination of national oppression is achievable at all in capitalist society, it is possible only under a consistently democratic republican system and state administration that guarantee complete equality for all nations and languages. The right of all the nations forming part of Russia freely to secede and form independent states must be recognized. To deny them this right, or to fail to take measures guaranteeing its practical realization, is equivalent to supporting a policy of seizure and annexation. It is only the recognition by the proletariat of the right of nations to secede that can ensure complete solidarity among the workers of the various nations and help to bring the nations closer together on truly democratic lines. The right of nations freely to secede must not be confused with the expediency of secession of a given nation at a given moment. The party of the proletariat must decide the latter question quite independently in each particular case from the standpoint of the interests of the social development as a whole and of the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat for socialism. The party demands broad regional autonomy, the abolition of supervision from above, the abolition of a compulsory state language and the determination of the boundaries of the self-governing and autonomous regions by the local population itself in accordance with the economic and social conditions, the national composition of the population, and so forth. The party of the proletariat resolutely rejects what is known as national cultural autonomy, under which education, etc., is removed from the competence of the state and placed within the competence of some kind of national diets. National cultural autonomy artificially divides the workers living in one locality, and even working in the same industrial enterprise, according to their various national cultures. In other words, it strengthens the ties between the workers and the bourgeois culture of individual nations, whereas the aim of the Social Democrats is to develop the international culture of the world proletariat. The party demands that a fundamental law shall be embodied in the Constitution annulling all privileges enjoyed by any nation whatever and all infringements of the rights of national minorities. The interests of the working class demand that the workers of all the nationalities of Russia should have common proletarian organizations, political, trade union, educational institutions of the cooperatives and so forth. Only such common organizations of the workers of the various nationalities will make it possible for the proletariat to wage a successful struggle against international capital and bourgeois nationalism. Lenin and Stalin, The Russian Revolution, pp. 52-3. Thus, the April conference exposed the opportunist, anti-Leninist stand of Kamenev, Zinoviev, Pyatakov, Bukharin, Rykov and their small following. The conference unanimously supported Lenin by taking up a precise stand on all important questions and adopting a course leading to the victory of the socialist revolution. 3. Successes of the Bolshevik Party in the capital. Abortive offensive of the armies of the provisional government. Suppression of the July demonstration of workers and soldiers. On the basis of the decisions of the April conference, the party developed extensive activities in order to win over the masses, and to train and organize them for battle. The party line in that period was, by patiently explaining the Bolshevik policy and exposing the compromising policy of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, to isolate these parties from the masses and to win a majority in the Soviets. In addition to the work in the Soviets, the Bolsheviks carried on extensive activities in the trade unions and in the factory committees. Particularly extensive was the work of the Bolsheviks in the army. Military organizations began to arise everywhere. The Bolsheviks worked indefatigably at the front and in the rear to organize the soldiers and sailors. A particularly important part in making the soldiers active revolutionaries was played at the front by the Bolshevik newspaper, Okonaya Pravda, Trench Truth. Thanks to Bolshevik propaganda and agitation, already in the early months of the revolution the workers in many cities held new elections to the Soviets, especially to the district Soviets, drove out the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries and elected followers of the Bolshevik Party in their stead. The work of the Bolsheviks yielded splendid results, especially in Petrograd. A Petrograd conference of factory committees was held from May 30th to June 3, 1917. At this conference 3/4 of the delegates already supported the Bolsheviks. Almost the entire Petrograd proletariat supported the Bolshevik slogan, "All power to the Soviets." On June 3, 1917, the first All-Russian Congress of Soviets met. The Bolsheviks were still in the minority in the Soviets. They had a little over 100 delegates at this Congress, compared with 700 or 800 Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries and others. At the first Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks insistently stressed the fatal consequences of compromise with the bourgeoisie and exposed the imperialist character of the war. Lenin made a speech at the Congress in which he showed the correctness of the Bolshevik line and declared that only a government of Soviets could give bread to the working people, land to the peasants, secure peace and lead the country out of chaos. A mass campaign was being conducted at that time in the working-class districts of Petrograd for the organization of a demonstration and for the presentation of demands to the Congress of Soviets. In its anxiety to prevent the workers from demonstrating without its authorization, and in the hope of utilizing the revolutionary sentiments of the masses for its own ends, the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet decided to call a demonstration for June 18, July 1. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries expected that it would take place under anti-Bolshevik slogans. The Bolshevik Party began energetic preparations for this demonstration. Comrade Stalin wrote in Pravda that It is our task to make sure that the demonstration in Petrograd on June 18 takes place under our revolutionary slogans. The demonstration of June 18, 1917, was held at the graves of the martyrs of the revolution. It proved to be a veritable review of the forces of the Bolshevik Party. It revealed the growing revolutionary spirit of the masses and their growing confidence in the Bolshevik Party. The slogans displayed by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries calling for confidence in the provisional government and urging the continuation of the war were lost in a sea of Bolshevik slogans. 400,000 demonstrators carried banners bearing the slogans, "Down with the war," "Down with the 10 capitalist ministers," "All power to the Soviets." It was a complete fiasco for the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, a fiasco for the provisional government in the capital of the country. Nevertheless, the provisional government received the support of the First Congress of the Soviets and decided to continue the imperialist policy. On that very day, June 18, the provisional government, in obedience to the wishes of the British and French imperialists, drove the soldiers at the front to take the offensive. The bourgeoisie regarded this as the only means of putting an end to the revolution. In the event of the success of the offensive, the bourgeoisie hoped to take the whole power into its own hands, to push the Soviets out of the arena, and to crush the Bolsheviks. Again, in the event of its failure, the entire blame could be thrown upon the Bolsheviks by accusing them of disintegrating the army. There could be no doubt that the offensive would fail. And fail it did. The soldiers were worn out, they did not understand the purpose of the offensive, they had no confidence in their officers who were alien to them, there was a shortage of artillery and shells. All this made the failure of the offensive a foregone conclusion. The news of the offensive at the front, and then of its collapse, roused the capital. The indignation of the workers and soldiers knew no bounds. It became apparent that when the provisional government proclaimed a policy of peace it was hoodwinking the people, and that it wanted to continue the imperialist war. It became apparent that the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviets and the Petrograd Soviet were unwilling or unable to check the criminal deeds of the provisional government and themselves trailed in its wake. The revolutionary indignation of the Petrograd workers and soldiers boiled over. On July 3, 16, spontaneous demonstrations started in the Vyborg district of Petrograd. They continued all day. The transfer of power to the Soviets. The Bolshevik Party was opposed to armed action at that time, for it considered that the revolutionary crisis had not yet matured, that the army in the provinces were not yet prepared to support an uprising in the capital, and that an isolated and premature rising might only make it easier for the counter-revolutionaries to crush the vanguard of the revolution. But when it became obviously impossible to keep the masses from demonstrating, the party resolved to participate in the demonstration in order to lend it a peaceful and organized character. This the Bolshevik Party succeeded in doing. Hundreds of thousands of men and women marched to the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet and the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of Soviets, where they demanded that the Soviets take the power into their own hands, break with the imperialist bourgeoisie, and pursue an active peace policy. Notwithstanding the pacific character of the demonstration, reactionary units, detachments of officers and cadets were brought out against it. The streets of Petrograd ran with the blood of workers and soldiers. The most ignorant and counter-revolutionary units of the army were summoned from the front to suppress the workers. After suppressing the demonstration of workers and soldiers, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, in alliance with the bourgeoisie and White Guard generals, fell upon the Bolshevik Party. The Pravda premises were wrecked. Pravda, Soldatskaya Pravda, Soldier's Truth, and a number of other Bolshevik newspapers were suppressed. A worker named Voinev was killed by cadets in the street merely for selling Listok. Pravda Bulletin. Disarming of the Red Guards began. Revolutionary units of the Petrograd garrison were withdrawn from the capital and dispatched to the trenches. Arrests were carried out in the rear and at the front. On July 7 a warrant was issued for Lenin's arrest. A number of prominent members of the Bolshevik Party were arrested. The Trude printing plant, where the Bolshevik publications were printed, was wrecked. The procurator of the Petrograd Court of Sessions announced that Lenin and a number of other Bolsheviks were being charged with high treason and the organization of an armed uprising. The charge against Lenin was fabricated at the headquarters of General Denikin and was based on the testimony of spies and agents provocateurs. Thus the coalition provisional government, which included such leading representatives of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries as Tsereteli, Skobelev, Kerensky and Chernov, sank to the depths of downright imperialism and counter-revolution. Instead of a policy of peace, it had adopted the policy of continuing war. Instead of protecting the democratic rights of the people, it had adopted the policy of nullifying these rights and suppressing the workers and soldiers by force of arms. What Guchkov and Milikov, the representatives of the bourgeoisie, had hesitated to do, was done by the socialists, Kerensky and Tsereteli. Chernov and Skobelev. The dual power had come to an end. It ended in favor of the bourgeoisie, for the whole power had passed into the hands of the provisional government, while the Soviets, with their socialist revolutionary and Menshevik leaders, had become an appendage of the provisional government. The peaceful period of the revolution had ended, for now the bayonet had been placed on the agenda. In view of the changed situation, the Bolshevik Party decided to change its tactics. It went underground, arranged for a safe hiding place for its leader, Lenin, and began to prepare for an uprising with the object of overthrowing the power of the bourgeoisie by force of arms and setting up the power of the Soviets. 4. The Bolshevik Party adopts the course of preparing for armed uprising. 6th Party Congress. The 6th Congress of the Bolshevik Party met in Petrograd in the midst of a frenzied campaign of Bolshevik baiting in the bourgeois and petty bourgeois press. It assembled 10 years after the 5th, London, Congress and 5 years after the Prague Conference of the Bolsheviks. The Congress, which was held secretly, sat from July 26 to August 3, 1917. All that appeared in the press was an announcement of its convocation. The place of meeting was not divulged. The first sittings were held in the Vyborg district, the later ones in a school near the Narva Gate, where a house of culture now stands. The bourgeois press demanded the arrest of the delegates. Detectives frantically scoured the city trying to discover the meeting place of the Congress, but in vain. And so, 5 months after the overthrow of TSRDM, the Bolsheviks were compelled to meet in secret, while Lenin, the leader of the Proletarian Party, was forced to go into hiding and took refuge in a shanty near Razliv station. He was being hunted high and low by the sleuths of the Provisional Government and was therefore unable to attend the Congress, but he guided its labors from his place of concealment through his close colleagues and disciples in Petrograd: Stalin, Sverdlov, Molotov, Orjonikidze. The Congress was attended by 157 delegates with vote and 128 with voice but no vote. At that time the party had a membership of about 240,000. On July 3, i.e., before the workers' demonstration was broken up, when the Bolsheviks were still functioning legally, the party had 41 publications, of which 29 were in Russian and 12 in other languages. The persecution to which the Bolsheviks and the working class were subjected during the July days, far from diminishing the influence of our party, only enhanced it. The delegates from the provinces cited numerous facts to show that the workers and soldiers had begun to desert the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries en masse, contemptuously styling them social jailers. Workers and soldiers belonging to the Menshevik and Socialist Revolutionary parties were tearing up their membership cards in anger and disgust and applying for admission to the Bolshevik Party. The chief items discussed at the Congress were the political report of the Central Committee and the political situation. Comrade Stalin made the reports on both these questions. He showed with the utmost clarity how the revolution was growing and developing despite all the efforts of the bourgeoisie to suppress it. He pointed out that the revolution had placed on the order of the day the task of establishing workers' control over the production and distribution of products, of turning over the land to the peasants, and of transferring the power from the bourgeoisie to the working class and poor peasantry. He said that the revolution was assuming the character of a socialist revolution. The political situation in the country had changed radically after the July days. The dual power had come to an end. The Soviets, led by socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, had refused to take over full power and had therefore lost all power. The power was now concentrated in the hands of the bourgeois provisional government, and the latter was continuing to disarm the revolution, to smash its organizations and to destroy the Bolshevik Party. All possibility of a peaceful development of the revolution had vanished. Only one thing remained, comrade Stalin said, namely, to take power by force, by overthrowing the provisional government. And only the proletariat, in alliance with the poor peasants, could take power by force. The Soviets, still controlled by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, had landed in the camp of the bourgeoisie, and under existing conditions could be expected to act only as subsidiaries of the provisional government. Now, after the July days, Comrade Stalin said, the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," had to be withdrawn. However, the temporary withdrawal of this slogan did not in any way imply a renunciation of the struggle for the power of the Soviets. It was not the Soviets in general, as organs of revolutionary struggle, that were in question, but only the existing Soviets, the Soviets controlled by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. The peaceful period of the revolution has ended, said Comrade Stalin. A non-peaceful period has begun, a period of clashes and explosions. Lenin and Stalin, Russian Revolution, pp. 139-140. The party was headed for armed uprising. There were some at the Congress who, reflecting the bourgeois influence, opposed the adoption of the course of socialist revolution. The Trotskyite Preobrazhensky proposed that the resolution on the conquest of power should state that the country could be directed towards socialism only in the event of a proletarian revolution in the West. This Trotskyite motion was opposed by Comrade Stalin. He said, the possibility is not excluded that Russia will be the country that will lay the road to socialism. We must discard the antiquated idea that only Europe can show us the way. There is dogmatic Marxism and creative Marxism. I stand by the latter. Page 146. Bukharin, who held a Trotskyite position, asserted that the peasants supported the war, that they were in a bloc with the bourgeoisie and would not follow the working class. Retorting to Bukharin, Comrade Stalin showed that there were different kinds of peasants. There were the rich peasants who supported the imperialist bourgeoisie, and there were the poor peasants who sought an alliance with the working class and would support it in a struggle for the victory of the revolution. The Congress rejected Preobrazhensky's and Bukharin's amendments and approved the resolution submitted by Comrade Stalin. The Congress discussed the economic platform of the Bolsheviks and approved it. Its main points were the confiscation of the landed estates and the nationalization of all the land, the nationalization of the banks, the nationalization of large-scale industry, and workers' control over production and distribution. The Congress stressed the importance of the fight for workers' control over production, which was later to play a significant part during the nationalization of the large industrial enterprises. In all its decisions, the Sixth Congress particularly stressed Lenin's principle of an alliance between the proletariat and the poor peasantry as a condition for the victory of the socialist revolution. The Congress condemned the Menshevik theory that the trade unions should be neutral. It pointed out that the momentous tasks confronting the working class of Russia could be accomplished only if the trade unions remained militant class organizations recognizing the political leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The Congress adopted a resolution on the youth leagues, which at that time frequently sprang up spontaneously. As a result of the party's subsequent efforts, it succeeded in definitely securing the adherence of these young organizations, which became a reserve of the party. The Congress discussed whether Lenin should appear for trial. Kamenev, Rykov, Trotsky and others had held even before the Congress that Lenin ought to appear before the counter-revolutionary court. Comrade Stalin was vigorously opposed to Lenin's appearing for trial. This was also the stand of the Sixth Congress, for it considered that it would be a lynching, not a trial. The Congress had no doubt that the bourgeoisie wanted only one thing: the physical destruction of Lenin as the most dangerous enemy of the bourgeoisie. The Congress protested against the police persecution of the leaders of the revolutionary proletariat by the bourgeoisie, and sent a message of greeting to Lenin. The Sixth Congress adopted new party rules. These rules provided that all party organizations shall be built on the principle of democratic centralism. This meant, 1. That all directing bodies of the party, from top to bottom, shall be elected. 2. That party bodies shall give periodical accounts of their activities to their respective party organizations. 3. That there shall be strict party discipline and the subordination of the minority to the majority. 4. That all decisions of higher bodies shall be absolutely binding on lower bodies and on all party members. The party rules provided that admission of new members to the party shall be through local party organizations on the recommendation of 2 party members and on the sanction of a general membership meeting of the local organization. The Sixth Congress admitted the Mezrayanchi and their leader, Trotsky, into the party. They were a small group that had existed in Petrograd since 1913 and consisted of Trotskyite Mensheviks and a number of former Bolsheviks who had split away from the party. During the war, the Mezrayisti were a centrist organization. They fought the Bolsheviks, but in many respects disagreed with the Mensheviks, thus occupying an intermediate, centrist, vacillating position. During the Sixth Party Congress, the Mezrayisti declared that they were in agreement with the Bolsheviks on all points and requested admission to the party. The request was granted by the Congress in the expectation that they would in time become real Bolsheviks. Some of the Mezrayisti, Volodarsky and Uritsky, for example, actually did become Bolsheviks. As to Trotsky and some of his close friends, they, as it later became apparent, had joined not to work in the interests of the party, but to disrupt and destroy it from within. The decisions of the Sixth Congress were all intended to prepare the proletariat and the poorest peasantry for an armed uprising. The Sixth Congress headed the Party for Armed Uprising for the Socialist Revolution. The Congress issued a party manifesto calling upon the workers, soldiers and peasants to muster their forces for decisive battles with the bourgeoisie. It ended with the words, "Prepare, then, for new battles, comrades in arms. Staunchly, manfully and calmly, without yielding to provocation, muster your forces and form your fighting columns. Rally under the banner of the party, proletarians and soldiers. Rally under our banner, downtrodden of the villages." 5. General Kornilov's plot against the revolution. Suppression of the plot. Petrograd and Moscow Soviets go over to the Bolsheviks. Having seized all power, the bourgeoisie began preparations to destroy the now weakened Soviets and to set up an open counter-revolutionary dictatorship. The millionaire Ryabushinsky insolently declared that the way out of the situation was, for the gaunt hand of famine, of destitution of the people, to seize the false friends of the people, the democratic Soviets and committees, by the throat. At the front, courts-martial wreaked savage vengeance on the soldiers, and meted out death sentences wholesale. On August 3, 1917, General Kornilov, the commander-in-chief, demanded the introduction of the death penalty behind the lines as well. On August 12, a Council of State, convened by the Provisional. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, Government to mobilize the forces of the bourgeoisie and the landlords, opened in the Grand Theater in Moscow. The council was attended chiefly by representatives of the landlords, the bourgeoisie, the generals, the officers and Cossacks. The Soviets were represented by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. In protest against the convocation of the Council of State, the Bolsheviks on the day of its opening called a general strike in Moscow in which the majority of the workers took part. Simultaneously, strikes took place in a number of other cities. The socialist revolutionary Kerensky threatened in a fit of boasting at the council to suppress, by iron and blood, every attempt at a revolutionary movement, including unauthorized attempts of the peasants to seize the lands of the landlords. The counter-revolutionary General Kornilov bluntly demanded that the committees and Soviets be abolished. Bankers, merchants and manufacturers flocked to Kornilov at general headquarters, promising him money and support. Representatives of the Allies, Britain and France, also came to General Kornilov, demanding that action against the revolution be not delayed. General Kornilov's plot against the revolution was coming to a head. Kornilov made his preparations openly. In order to distract attention, the conspirators started a rumor that the Bolsheviks were preparing an uprising in Petrograd to take place on August 27, the end of the first 6 months of the revolution. The provisional government, headed by Kerensky, furiously attacked the Bolsheviks and intensified the terror against the Proletarian Party. At the same time, General Kornilov massed troops in order to move them against Petrograd, abolish the Soviets and set up a military dictatorship. Kornilov had come to a preliminary agreement with Kerensky regarding his counter-revolutionary action. But no sooner had Kornilov's action begun than Kerensky made an abrupt right-about-face and dissociated himself from his ally. Kerensky feared that the masses who would rise against the Kornilovites and crush them would at the same time sweep away Kerensky's bourgeois government as well, unless it at once dissociated itself from the Kornilov affair. On August 25 Kornilov moved the 3rd Mounted Corps under the command of General Krymov against Petrograd, declaring that he intended to save the fatherland. In face of the Kornilov revolt, the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party called upon the workers and soldiers to put up active armed resistance to the counter-revolution. The workers hurriedly began to arm and prepared to resist. The Red Guard detachments grew enormously during these days. The trade unions mobilized their members. The revolutionary military units in Petrograd were also held in readiness for battle. Trenches were dug around Petrograd, barbed wire entanglements erected, and the railway tracks leading to the city were torn up. Several thousand armed sailors arrived from Kronstadt to defend the city. Delegates were sent to the Savage Division, which was advancing on Petrograd. When these delegates explained the purpose of Kornilov's action to the Caucasian mountaineers of whom the Savage Division was made up, they refused to advance. Agitators were also dispatched to other Kornilov units. Wherever there was danger, revolutionary committees and headquarters were set up to fight Kornilov. In those days the mortally terrified socialist revolutionary and Menshevik leaders, Kerensky among them, turned for protection to the Bolsheviks, for they were convinced that the Bolsheviks were the only effective force in the capital that was capable of routing Kornilov. But while mobilizing the masses to crush the Kornilov revolt, the Bolsheviks did not discontinue their struggle against the Kerensky government. They exposed the government of Kerensky, the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, to the masses, pointing out that their whole policy was in effect assisting Kornilov's counter-revolutionary plot. The result of these measures was that the Kornilov revolt was crushed. General Krymov committed suicide. Kornilov and his fellow conspirators, Denikin and Lukomsky, were arrested. Very soon, however, Kerensky had them released. The rout of the Kornilov revolt revealed in a flash the relative strength of the revolution and the counter-revolution. It showed that the whole counter-revolutionary camp was doomed, from the generals and the Constitutional Democratic Party to the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who had become entangled in the meshes of the bourgeoisie. It became obvious that the influence of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries among the masses had been completely undermined by the policy of prolonging the unbearable strain of the war, and by the economic chaos caused by the protracted war. The defeat of the Kornilov revolt further showed that the Bolshevik Party had grown to be the decisive force of the revolution and was capable of foiling any attempt at counter-revolution. Our party was not yet the ruling party, but during the Kornilov days it acted as the real ruling power, for its instructions were unhesitatingly carried out by the workers and soldiers. Lastly, the rout of the Kornilov revolt showed that the seemingly dead Soviets actually possessed tremendous latent power of revolutionary resistance. There could be no doubt that it was the Soviets and their revolutionary committees that barred the way of the Kornilov troops and broke their strength. The struggle against Kornilov put new vitality into the languishing Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. It freed them from the sway of the policy of compromise. It led them into the open road of revolutionary struggle and turned them towards the Bolshevik Party. The influence of the Bolsheviks in the Soviets grew stronger than ever. Their influence spread rapidly in the rural districts as well. The Kornilov revolt made it clear to the broad masses of the peasantry that if the landlords and generals succeeded in smashing the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, they would next attack the peasantry. The mass of the poor peasants therefore began to rally closer to the Bolsheviks. As to the middle peasants, whose vacillations had retarded the development of the revolution in the period from April to August 1917, after the rout of Kornilov they definitely began to swing towards the Bolshevik party, joining forces with the poor peasants. The broad masses of the peasantry were coming to realize that only the Bolshevik party could deliver them from the war, and that only this party was capable of crushing the landlords and was prepared to turn over the land to the peasants. The months of September and October 1917 witnessed a tremendous increase in the number of seizures of landed estates by the peasants. Unauthorized plowing of the fields of landlords became widespread. The peasants had taken the road of revolution and neither coaxing nor punitive expeditions could any longer halt them. The tide of revolution was rising. There ensued a period of revival of the Soviets, of a change in their composition, their Bolshevization. Factories, mills and military units held new elections and sent to the Soviets representatives of the Bolshevik party in place of Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. On August 31st, the day following the victory over Kornilov, the Petrograd Soviet endorsed the Bolshevik policy. The old Menshevik and Socialist Revolutionary Presidium of the Petrograd Soviet, headed by Chikadze, resigned, thus clearing the way for the Bolsheviks. On September 5, the Moscow Soviet of Workers' deputies went over to the Bolsheviks. The Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik Presidium of the Moscow Soviet also resigned and left the way clear for the Bolsheviks. This meant that the chief conditions for a successful uprising were now ripe. The slogan, "All power to the Soviets," was again on the order of the day. But it was no longer the old slogan, the slogan of transferring the power to Menshevik and Socialist Revolutionary Soviets. This time it was a slogan calling for an uprising of the Soviets against the provisional government, the object being to transfer the whole power in the country to the Soviets now led by the Bolsheviks. Disintegration set in among the compromising parties. Under the pressure of the revolutionary peasants, a left wing formed within the Socialist Revolutionary Party, known as the Left Socialist Revolutionaries, who expressed their disapproval of the policy of compromise with the bourgeoisie. Among the Mensheviks, too, there appeared a group of lefts, the so-called internationalists, who gravitated towards the Bolsheviks. As to the anarchists, a group whose influence was insignificant to start with, they now definitely disintegrated into mini-groups, some of which merged with criminal elements, thieves and provocateurs, the dregs of society. Others became expropriators, by conviction, robbing the peasants and small-town folk, and appropriating the premises and funds of workers' clubs, while others still openly went over to the camp of the counter-revolutionaries, and devoted themselves to feathering their own nests as menials of the bourgeoisie. They were all opposed to authority of any kind, particularly and especially to the revolutionary authority of the workers and peasants, for they knew that a revolutionary government would not allow them to rob the people and steal public property. After the rout of Kornilov, the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries made one more attempt to stem the rising tide of revolution. With this purpose in view, on September 12, 1917, they convened an All-Russian Democratic Conference, consisting of representatives of the socialist parties, the compromising Soviets, trade unions, zemstvios, commercial and industrial circles and military units. The conference set up a provisional council of the Republic, known as the Pre-Parliament. The compromisers hoped with the help of the Pre-Parliament to halt the revolution and to divert the country from the path of a Soviet revolution to the path of bourgeois constitutional development, the path of bourgeois parliamentarism. But this was a hopeless attempt on the part of political bankrupts to turn back the wheel of revolution. It was bound to end in a fiasco, and end in a fiasco it did. The workers jeered at the parliamentary efforts of the compromisers and called the Predparliament, Pre-Parliament, a Predbannik, Pre-Bathhouse. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party decided to boycott the Pre-Parliament. True, the Bolshevik group in the Pre-Parliament, consisting of people like Kamenev and Teodorovich, were loath to leave it, but the Central Committee of the party compelled them to do so. Kamenev and Zinoviev stubbornly insisted on participation in the Pre-Parliament, striving thereby to divert the party from its preparations for the uprising. Comrade Stalin, speaking at a meeting of the Bolshevik group of the All-Russian Democratic Conference, vigorously opposed participation in the Pre-Parliament. He called the Pre-Parliament a Kornilov abortion. Lenin and Stalin considered that it would be a grave mistake to participate in the Pre-Parliament even for a short time, for it might encourage in the masses the false hope that the Pre-Parliament could really do something for the working people. At the same time, the Bolsheviks made intensive preparations for the convocation of the Second Congress of Soviets, in which they expected to have a majority. Under the pressure of the Bolshevik Soviets, and notwithstanding the subterfuges of the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries on the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, the Second All Russian Congress of Soviets was called for the second half of October 1917. 6. October Uprising in Petrograd and arrest of the Provisional Government, Second Congress of Soviets in. Formation of the Soviet government, decrees of the Second Congress of Soviets on Peace and Land, victory of the Socialist Revolution, reasons for the victory of the Socialist Revolution. The Bolsheviks began intensive preparations for the uprising. Lenin declared that, having secured a majority in the Soviets of workers in soldiers' deputies in both the capitals, Moscow and Petrograd, the Bolsheviks could and should take the state power into their own hands. Grad should be seized in order to ensure the success of the uprising, and so forth. On October 7, Lenin secretly arrived in Petrograd from Finland. On October 10, 1917, the historic meeting of the Central Committee of the party took place, at which it was decided to launch the armed uprising within the next few days. The historic resolution of the Central Committee of the party, drawn up by Lenin, stated, "The Central Committee recognizes that the international position of the Russian Revolution, the revolt in the German Navy, which is an extreme manifestation of the growth throughout Europe of the world socialist revolution, the threat of conclusion of peace by the imperialists with the object of strangling the revolution in Russia, as well as its military position, the indubitable decision of the Russian bourgeoisie and Kerensky and Company to surrender Petrograd to the Germans, and the fact that the Proletarian Party has gained a majority in the Soviets, all this, taken in conjunction with the peasant revolt and the swing of popular confidence towards our party, the elections in Moscow, and, finally, the obvious preparations being made for a second Kornilov affair, the withdrawal of troops from Petrograd, the dispatch of Cossacks to Petrograd, the surrounding of Minsk by Cossacks, etc. All this places the armed uprising on the order of the day. Considering therefore that an armed uprising is inevitable, and that the time for it is fully ripe, the Central Committee instructs all party organizations to be guided accordingly, and to discuss and decide all practical questions, the Congress of Soviets of the Northern Region, the withdrawal of troops from Petrograd, the action of our people in Moscow and Minsk, etc. From this point of view. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 6, page 303. Two members of the Central Committee, Kamenev and Zinoviev, spoke and voted against this historic decision. Like the Mensheviks, they dreamed of a bourgeois parliamentary republic, and slandered the working class by asserting that it was not strong enough to carry out a socialist revolution, that it was not mature enough to take power. Although at this meeting Trotsky did not vote against the resolution directly, he moved an amendment which would have reduced the chances of the uprising to naught and rendered it abortive. He proposed that the uprising should not be started before the Second Congress of Soviets met, a proposal which meant delaying the uprising, divulging its date, and forewarning the provisional government. The Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party sent its representatives to the Donets Basin, the Urals, Helsingfors, Kronstadt, the Southwestern Front and other places to organize the uprising. Comrades Voroshilov, Molotov, Dzerzhinsky, Orjonikidze, Kirov, Kaganovich, Kuibyshev, Frunz, Yaroslavsky and others were specially assigned by the party to direct the uprising in the provinces. Comrade Zhdanov carried on the work among the armed forces in Shadrisk, in the Urals. Comrade Yezhov made preparations for an uprising of the soldiers on the Western Front, in Byelorussia. The representatives of the Central Committee acquainted the leading members of the Bolshevik organizations in the provinces with the plan of the uprising and mobilized them in readiness to support the uprising in Petrograd. On the instructions of the Central Committee of the party, a revolutionary military committee of the Petrograd Soviet was set up. This body became the legally functioning headquarters of the uprising. Meanwhile the counter-revolutionaries, too, were hastily mustering their forces. The officers of the army formed a counter-revolutionary organization known as the Officers' League. Everywhere the counter-revolutionaries set up headquarters for the formation of shock battalions. By the end of October the counter-revolutionaries had 43 shock battalions at their command. Special battalions of Cavaliers of the Cross of St. George were formed. Kerensky's government considered the question of transferring the seat of government from Petrograd to Moscow. This made it clear that it was preparing to surrender Petrograd to the Germans in order to forestall the uprising in the city. The protest of the Petrograd workers and soldiers compelled the provisional government to remain in Petrograd. On October 16 an enlarged meeting of the Central Committee of the party was held. This meeting elected a party center, headed by Comrade Stalin, to direct the uprising. This party center was the leading core of the Revolutionary Military Committee of the Petrograd Soviet and had practical direction of the whole uprising. At the meeting of the Central Committee the capitulators Zinoviev and Kamenev again opposed the uprising. Meeting with a rebuff, they came out openly in the press against the uprising, against the party. On October 18 the Menshevik newspaper, Novaya Zhizn, printed a statement by Kamenev and Zinoviev declaring that the Bolsheviks were making preparations for an uprising, and that they, Kamenev and Zinoviev, considered it an adventurous gamble. Kamenev and Zinoviev thus disclosed to the enemy the decision of the Central Committee regarding the uprising. They revealed that an uprising had been planned to take place within a few days. This was treachery. Lenin wrote in this connection, Kamenev and Zinoviev have betrayed the decision of the Central Committee of their party on the armed uprising to Rodzianko and Kerensky. Lenin put before the Central Committee the question of Zinoviev's and Kamenev's expulsion from the party. Forewarned by the traitors, the enemies of the revolution at once began to take measures to prevent the uprising and to destroy the directing staff of the revolution, the Bolshevik Party. The provisional government called a secret meeting which decided upon measures for combating the Bolsheviks. On October 19, the provisional government hastily summoned troops from the front to Petrograd. The streets were heavily patrolled. The counter-revolutionaries succeeded in massing especially large forces in Moscow. The provisional government drew up a plan, on the eve of the Second Congress of Soviets, the Smolny, the headquarters of the Bolshevik Central Committee, was to be attacked and occupied and the Bolshevik directing center destroyed. For this purpose the government summoned to Petrograd troops in whose loyalty it believed. But the days and even the hours of the provisional government were already numbered. Nothing could now halt the victorious march of the Socialist Revolution. On October 21, the Bolsheviks sent commissars of the Revolutionary Military Committee to all Revolutionary Army units. Throughout the remaining days before the uprising, energetic preparations for action were made in the army units and in the mills and factories. Precise instructions were also issued to the warships Aurora and Zarya. Svobody. At a meeting of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky in a fit of boasting blabbed to the enemy the date on which the Bolsheviks had planned to begin the armed uprising. In order not to allow Kerensky's government to frustrate the uprising, the Central Committee of the party decided to start and carry it through before the appointed time, and set its date for the day before the opening of the Second Congress of Soviets. Kerensky began his attack on the early morning of October 24, November 6, by ordering the suppression of the central organ of the Bolshevik Party, Rabyshy Put, Workers' Path, and the dispatch of armored cars to its editorial premises and to the printing plant of the Bolsheviks. By 10 a.m., however, on the instructions of Comrade Stalin, Red Guards and revolutionary soldiers pressed back the armored cars and placed a reinforced guard over the printing plant and the Rabyshy Put editorial offices. Towards 11 a.m., Rabyshy Put came out with a call for the overthrow of the provisional government. Simultaneously, on the instructions of the party center of the uprising, detachments of revolutionary soldiers and Red Guards were rushed to the Smolny. The uprising had begun. On the night of October 24, Lenin arrived at the Smolny and assumed personal direction of the uprising. All that night revolutionary units of the army and detachments of the Red Guard kept arriving at the Smolny. The Bolsheviks directed them to the center of the capital, to surround the Winter Palace, where the provisional government had entrenched itself. On October 25, November 7, Red Guards and revolutionary troops occupied the railway stations, post office, telegraph office, the ministries and the state bank. The pre-parliament was dissolved. The Smolny, the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet and of the Bolshevik Central Committee, became the headquarters of the revolution, from which all fighting orders emanated. The Petrograd workers in those days showed what a splendid schooling they had received under the guidance of the Bolshevik Party. The revolutionary units of the army, prepared for the uprising by the work of the Bolsheviks, carried out fighting orders with precision and fought side by side with the Red Guard. The navy did not lag behind the army. Kronstadt was a stronghold of the Bolshevik Party, and had long since refused to recognize the authority of the provisional government. The cruiser Aurora trained its guns on the Winter Palace, and on October 25 their thunder ushered in a new era, the era of the Great Socialist Revolution. On October 25, November 7, the Bolsheviks issued a manifesto to the citizens of Russia, announcing that the bourgeois provisional government had been deposed and that state power had passed into the hands of the Soviets. The provisional government had taken refuge in the Winter Palace under the protection of cadets and shock battalions. On the night of October 25, the revolutionary workers, soldiers and sailors took the Winter Palace by storm and arrested the provisional government. The armed uprising in Petrograd had won. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets opened in the Smolny at 10:45 p.m. on October 25, November 7, 1917, when the uprising in Petrograd was already in the full flush of victory and the power in the capital had actually passed into the hands of the Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks secured an overwhelming majority at the Congress. The Mensheviks, Bundists and Right Socialist Revolutionaries, seeing that their day was done, left the Congress, announcing that they refused to take any part in its labors. In a statement which was read at the Congress of Soviets, they referred to the October Revolution as a military plot. The Congress condemned the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries and, far from regretting their departure, welcomed it, for, it declared, thanks to the withdrawal of the traitors the Congress had become a real revolutionary Congress of workers and soldiers' deputies. The Congress proclaimed that all power had passed to the Soviets. Backed by the will of the vast majority of the workers, soldiers and peasants, backed by the victorious uprising of the workers and the garrison which had taken place in Petrograd, the Congress takes the power into its own hands. The proclamation of the Second Congress of Soviets read, on the night of October 26, November 8, 1917, the Second Congress of Soviets adopted the decree on peace. The Congress called upon the belligerent countries to conclude an immediate armistice for a period of not less than 3 months to permit negotiations for peace. While addressing itself to the governments and peoples of all the belligerent countries, the Congress at the same time appealed to the class-conscious workers of the 3 most advanced nations of mankind in the largest states participating in the present war, namely, Great Britain, France and Germany. It called upon these workers to help to bring to a successful conclusion the cause of peace, and at the same time the cause of the emancipation of the toiling and exploited masses of the population from all forms of slavery and all forms of exploitation. That same night the Second Congress of Soviets adopted the Decree on Land, which proclaimed that landlord ownership of land is abolished forthwith without compensation. The basis adopted for this agrarian law was a mandate, nakaz, of the peasantry, compiled from 242 mandates of peasants of various localities. In accordance with this mandate, private ownership of land was to be abolished forever and replaced by public or state ownership of the land. The lands of the landlords, of the Tsar's family and of the monasteries were to be turned over to all the toilers for their free use. By this decree the peasantry received from the October Socialist Revolution over 150 million desiatins, over 400 million acres, of land that had formerly belonged to the landlords, the bourgeoisie, the Tsar's family, the monasteries and the churches. Moreover, the peasants were released from paying rent to the landlords, which had amounted to about 500 million gold rubles annually. All mineral resources, oil, coal, ores, etc., forests and waters became the property of the people. Lastly, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets formed the first Soviet government, the Council of People's Commissars, which consisted entirely of Bolsheviks. Lenin was elected chairman of the first Council of People's Commissars. This ended the labors of the historic Second Congress of Soviets. The Congress delegates dispersed to spread the news of the victory of the Soviets in Petrograd and to ensure the extension of the power of the Soviets to the whole country. Not everywhere did power pass to the Soviets at once. While in Petrograd the Soviet government was already in existence, in Moscow fierce and stubborn fighting continued in the streets several days longer. In order to prevent the power from passing into the hands of the Moscow Soviet, the counter-revolutionary Menshevik and Socialist Revolutionary parties, together with White Guards and cadets, started an armed fight against the workers and soldiers. It took several days to rout the rebels and to establish the power of the Soviets in Moscow. In Petrograd itself, and in several of its districts, counter-revolutionary attempts to overthrow the Soviet power were made in the very first days of the victory of the revolution. On November 10, 1917, Kerensky, who during the uprising had fled from Petrograd to the Northern Front, mustered several Cossack units and dispatched them against Petrograd under the command of General Krasnov. On November 11, 1917, a counter-revolutionary organization calling itself the Committee for the Salvation of the Fatherland in the Revolution, headed by socialist revolutionaries, raised a mutiny of cadets in Petrograd. But the mutiny was suppressed by sailors and Red Guards without much difficulty by the evening of the same day, and on November 13, General Krasnov was routed near the Pulkovo Hills. Lenin personally directed the suppression of the anti-Soviet mutiny, just as he had personally directed the October uprising. His inflexible firmness and calm confidence of victory inspired and welded the masses. The enemy was smashed. Krasnov was taken prisoner and pledged his word of honor to terminate the struggle against the Soviet power. And on his word of honor, he was released. But, as it later transpired, the general violated his word of honor. As to Kerensky, disguised as a woman, he managed to disappear in an unknown direction. In Mogilev, at the general headquarters of the army, General Duhonin, the commander-in-chief, also attempted a mutiny. When the Soviet government instructed him to start immediate negotiations for an armistice with the German command, he refused to obey. Thereupon, Duhonin was dismissed by order of the Soviet government. The counter-revolutionary general headquarters was broken up and Duhonin himself was killed by the soldiers, who had risen against him. Certain notorious opportunists within the party, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Rykov, Shlapnikov and others, also made a sally against the Soviet power. They demanded the formation of an all-socialist government, to include Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, who had just been overthrown by the October Revolution. On November 15, 1917, the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party adopted a resolution rejecting agreement with these counter-revolutionary parties, and proclaiming Kamenev and Zinoviev strikebreakers of the revolution. On November 17, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Rykov and Milutin, disagreeing with the policy of the party, announced their resignation from the Central Committee. That same day, November 17, Nogin, in his own name and in the names of Rykov, V. Milutin, Teodorovich, A. Shlapnikov, D. Ryazanov, Uraniev and Larin, members of the Council of People's Commissars, announced their disagreement with the policy of the Central Committee of the party and their resignation from the Council of People's Commissars. The desertion of this handful of cowards caused jubilation among the enemies of the October Revolution. The bourgeoisie and its henchmen proclaimed with malicious glee the collapse of Bolshevism and presaged the early end of the Bolshevik Party. But not for a moment was the party shaken by this handful of deserters. The Central Committee of the party contemptuously branded them as deserters from the revolution and accomplices of the bourgeoisie, and proceeded with its work. As to the left, socialist revolutionaries, they, desirous of retaining their influence over the peasant masses, who definitely sympathized with the Bolsheviks, decided not to quarrel with the latter and for the time being to maintain a united front with them. The Congress of Peasant Soviets, which took place in November 1917, recognized all the gains of the October Socialist Revolution and endorsed the decrees of the Soviet government. An agreement was concluded with the left, socialist revolutionaries, and several of their number were given posts on the Council of People's Commissars, Kolagayev, Spiridonova, Proshian and Steinberg. However, this agreement lasted only until the signing of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk and the formation of the Committees of the Poor Peasants, when a deep cleavage took place among the peasantry and when the left, socialist revolutionaries, coming more and more to reflect the interests of the kulaks, started a revolt against the Bolsheviks and were routed by the Soviet government. In the interval from October 1917 to February 1918, the Soviet Revolution spread throughout the vast territory of the country at such a rapid rate that Lenin referred to it as a triumphal march of Soviet power. The Great October Socialist Revolution had won. There were several reasons for this comparatively easy victory of the Socialist Revolution in Russia. The following chief reasons should be noted. 1. The October Revolution was confronted by an enemy so comparatively weak, so badly organized and so politically inexperienced as the Russian bourgeoisie. Economically still weak, and completely dependent on government contracts, the Russian bourgeoisie lacked sufficient political self-reliance and initiative to find a way out of the situation. It had neither the experience of the French bourgeoisie, for example, in political combination and political chicanery on a broad scale, nor the schooling of the British bourgeoisie in broadly conceived crafty compromise. It had but recently sought to reach an understanding with the Tsar, yet now that the Tsar had been overthrown by the February Revolution, and the bourgeoisie itself had come to power, it was unable to think of anything better than to continue the policy of the detested Tsar in all its essentials. Like the Tsar, it stood for war to a victorious finish, although the war was beyond the country's strength and had reduced the people and the army to a state of utter exhaustion. Like the Tsar, it stood for the preservation in the main of big landed property, although the peasantry was perishing from lack of land and the weight of the landlord's yoke. As to its labor policy, the Russian bourgeoisie outstripped even the Tsar in its hatred of the working class, for it not only strove to preserve and strengthen the yoke of the factory owners, but to render it intolerable by wholesale lockouts. It is not surprising that the people saw no essential difference between the policy of the Tsar and the policy of the bourgeoisie, and that they transferred their hatred of the Tsar to the provisional government of the bourgeoisie. As long as the compromising socialist revolutionary and Menshevik parties possessed a certain amount of influence among the people, the bourgeoisie could use them as a screen and preserve its power. But after the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries had exposed themselves as agents of the imperialist bourgeoisie, thus forfeiting their influence among the people, the bourgeoisie and its provisional government were left without a support. 2. The October Revolution was headed by so revolutionary a class as the working class of Russia, a class which had been steeled in battle, which had in a short space passed through 2 revolutions, and which by the eve of the 3rd revolution had won recognition as the leader of the people in the struggle for peace, land, liberty and socialism. If the revolution had not had a leader like the working class of Russia, a leader that had earned the confidence of the people, there would have been no alliance between the workers and peasants, and without such an alliance the victory of the October Revolution would have been impossible. 3. The working class of Russia had so effective an ally in the revolution as the poor peasantry, which comprised the overwhelming majority of the peasant population. The experience of 8 months of revolution, which may unhesitatingly be compared to the experience of several decades of normal development, had not been in vain as far as the mass of the laboring peasants were concerned. During this period they had had the opportunity to test all the parties of Russia in practice and convince themselves that neither the constitutional Democrats nor the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks would seriously quarrel with the landlords or sacrifice themselves for the interests of the peasants. That there was only one party in Russia, the Bolshevik Party, which was in no way connected with the landlords and which was prepared to crush them in order to satisfy the needs of the peasants. This served as a solid basis for the alliance of the proletariat and the poor peasantry. The existence of this alliance between the working class and the poor peasantry determined the conduct of the middle peasants, who had long been vacillating and only on the eve of the October uprising wholeheartedly swung over towards the revolution and joined forces with the poor peasants. It goes without saying that without this alliance the October Revolution could not have been victorious. 4. The working class was headed by a party so tried and tested in political battles as the Bolshevik Party. Only a party like the Bolshevik Party, courageous enough to lead the people in decisive attack, and cautious enough to keep clear of all the submerged rocks in its path to the goal, only such a party could so skillfully merge into one common revolutionary torrent such diverse revolutionary movements as the General Democratic Movement for Peace, the Peasant Democratic Movement for the seizure of the landed estates, the movement of the oppressed nationalities for national liberation and national equality, and the socialist movement of the proletariat for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Undoubtedly, the merging of these diverse revolutionary streams, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution into one common powerful revolutionary torrent, decided the fate of capitalism in Russia. 5. The October Revolution began at a time when the imperialist war was still at its height, when the principal bourgeois states were split into two hostile camps, and when, absorbed in mutual war and undermining each other's strength, they were unable to intervene effectively in Russian affairs and actively to oppose the October Revolution. This undoubtedly did much to facilitate the victory of the October Socialist Revolution. 7. Struggle of the Bolshevik Party to consolidate the Soviet power. Peace of Brest-Litovsk. 7th Party Congress. In order to consolidate the Soviet power, the old, bourgeois state machine had to be shattered and destroyed and a new, Soviet state machine set up in its place. Further, it was necessary to destroy the survivals of the division of society into estates and the regime of national oppression, to abolish the privileges of the church, to suppress the counter-revolutionary press and counter-revolutionary organizations of all kinds, legal and illegal, and to dissolve the bourgeois constituent assembly. Following on the nationalization of the land, all large-scale industry had also to be nationalized. And, lastly, the state of war had to be ended, for the war was hampering the consolidation of the Soviet power more than anything else. All these measures were carried out in the course of a few months, from the end of 1917 to the middle of 1918. The sabotage of the officials of the old ministries, engineered by the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, was smashed and overcome. The ministries were abolished and replaced by Soviet administrative machinery and appropriate people's commissariats. The Supreme Council of National Economy was set up to administer the industry of the country. The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, Vecheka, was created to combat counter-revolution and sabotage, and F. Dzerzhinsky was placed at its head. The formation of a Red Army and Navy was decreed. The Constituent Assembly, the elections to which had largely been held prior to the October Revolution, and which refused to recognize the decrees of the Second Congress of Soviets on peace, land and the transfer of power to the Soviets, was dissolved. In order to put an end to the survivals of feudalism, the estates system, and inequality in all spheres of social life, decrees were issued abolishing the estates, removing restrictions based on nationality or religion, separating the church from the state and the schools from the church, establishing equality for women and the equality of all the nationalities of Russia. A special edict of the Soviet government known as the Declaration of Rights of the Peoples of Russia laid down as a law the right of the peoples of Russia to unhampered development and complete equality. In order to undermine the economic power of the bourgeoisie and to create a new Soviet national economy and, in the first place, to create a new Soviet industry, the banks, railways, foreign trade, the mercantile fleet and all large enterprises in all branches of industry. Coal, metal, oil, chemicals, machine building, textiles, sugar, etc., were nationalized. To render our country financially independent of the foreign capitalists and free from exploitation by them, the foreign loans contracted by the Russian Tsar and the provisional government were annulled. The people of our country refused to pay debts which had been incurred for the continuation of the war of conquest and which had placed our country in bondage to foreign capital. These and similar measures undermined the very root of the power of the bourgeoisie, the landlords, the reactionary officials and the counter-revolutionary parties, and considerably strengthened the position of the Soviet government within the country. But the position of the Soviet government could not be deemed fully secure as long as Russia was in a state of war with Germany and Austria. In order finally to consolidate the Soviet power, the war had to be ended. The party therefore launched the fight for peace from the moment of the victory of the October Revolution. The Soviet government called upon all the belligerent peoples and their governments to start immediate negotiations for a just, democratic peace. But the Allies, Great Britain and France, refused to accept the proposal of the Soviet government. In view of this refusal, the Soviet government, in compliance with the will of the Soviets, decided to start negotiations with Germany and Austria. The negotiations began on December 3 in Brest-Litovsk. On December 5 an armistice was signed. The negotiations took place at a time when the country was in a state of economic disruption, when war weariness was universal, when our troops were abandoning the trenches and the front was collapsing. It became clear in the course of the negotiations that the German imperialists were out to seize huge portions of the territory of the former Tsarist Empire and to turn Poland, the Ukraine and the Baltic countries into dependencies of Germany. To continue the war under such conditions would have meant staking the very existence of the newborn Soviet Republic. The working class and the peasantry were confronted with the necessity of accepting onerous terms of peace, of retreating before the most dangerous marauder of the time, German imperialism, in order to secure a respite in which to strengthen the Soviet power and to create a new army, the Red Army, which would be able to defend the country from enemy attack. All the counter-revolutionaries, from the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries to the most errant White Guards, conducted a frenzied campaign against the conclusion of peace. Their policy was clear. They wanted to wreck the peace negotiations, provoke a German offensive and thus imperil the still weak Soviet power and endanger the gains of the workers and peasants. Their allies in this sinister scheme were Trotsky and his accomplice, Bukharin, the latter, together with Radek and Pyatakov, heading a group which was hostile to the party but camouflaged itself under the name of Left Communists. Trotsky and a group of Left Communists began a fierce struggle within the party against Lenin, demanding the continuation of the war. These people were clearly playing into the hands of the German imperialists and the counter-revolutionaries within the country, for they were working to expose the young Soviet Republic, which had not yet any army, to the blows of German imperialism. This was really a policy of provocateurs, skillfully masked by left phraseology. On February 10, 1918, the peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk were broken off. Although Lenin and Stalin, in the name of the Central Committee of the party, had insisted that peace be signed, Trotsky, who was chairman of the Soviet delegation at Brest-Litovsk, treacherously violated the direct instructions of the Bolshevik Party. He announced that the Soviet Republic refused to conclude peace on the terms proposed by Germany. At the same time, he informed the Germans that the Soviet Republic would not fight and would continue to demobilize the army. This was monstrous. The German imperialists could have desired nothing more from this traitor to the interests of the Soviet country. The German government broke the armistice and assumed the offensive. For the onslaught of the German troops. The Germans advanced swiftly, seizing enormous territory and threatening Petrograd. German imperialism invaded the Soviet land with the object of overthrowing the Soviet power and converting our country into its colony. The ruins of the old Tsarist army could not withstand the armed hosts of German imperialism, and steadily retreated under their blows. But the armed intervention of the German imperialists was the signal for a mighty revolutionary upsurge in the country. The party and the Soviet government issued the call, "The socialist fatherland is in danger," and in response the working class energetically began to form regiments of the Red Army. The young detachments of the new army, the Army of the Revolutionary People, heroically resisted the German marauders who were armed to the teeth. At Narva and Pskov the German invaders met with a resolute repulse. Their advance on Petrograd was checked. February 23, the day the forces of German imperialism were repulsed, is regarded as the birthday of the Red Army. On February 18, 1918, the Central Committee of the party had approved Lenin's proposal to send a telegram to the German government offering to conclude an immediate peace. But in order to secure more advantageous terms, the Germans continued to advance, and only on February 22 did the German government express its willingness to sign peace. The terms were now far more onerous than those originally proposed. Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov had to wage a stubborn fight on the Central Committee against Trotsky, Bukharin and the other Trotskyites before they secured a decision in favor of the conclusion of peace. Bukharin and Trotsky, Lenin declared, actually helped the German imperialists and hindered the growth and development of the revolution in Germany. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 22, page 307. On February 23, the Central Committee decided to accept the terms of the German command and to sign the peace treaty. The treachery of Trotsky and Bukharin cost the Soviet Republic dearly. Latvia, Estonia, not to mention Poland, passed into German hands. The Ukraine was severed from the Soviet Republic and converted into a vassal of the German state. The Soviet Republic undertook to pay an indemnity to the Germans. Meanwhile, the left communists continued their struggle against Lenin, sinking deeper and deeper into the slough of treachery. The Moscow Regional Bureau of the party, of which the left communists, Bukharin, Osinski, Yakovleva, Stukov and Mantsev, had temporarily seized control, passed a resolution of no confidence in the Central Committee, a resolution designed to split the party. The Bureau declared that it considered a split in the party in the very near future scarcely avoidable. The left communists even went so far in their resolution as to adopt an anti-Soviet stand. In the interests of the international revolution, they declared, we consider it expedient to consent to the possible loss of the Soviet power, which has now become purely formal. Lenin branded this decision as strange and monstrous. At that time, the real cause of this anti-party behavior of Trotsky and the left communists was not yet clear to the party. But the recent trial of the anti-Soviet bloc of rights and Trotskyites, beginning of 1938, has now revealed that Bukharin and the group of left communists, headed by him, together with Trotsky and the left socialist revolutionaries, were at that time secretly conspiring against the Soviet government. Now it is known that Bukharin, Trotsky and their fellow conspirators had determined to wreck the peace of Brest-Litovsk, arrest V. I. Lenin, J. V. Stalin and Y. M. Sverdlov, assassinate them, and form a new government consisting of Bukharinites, Trotskyites and left socialist revolutionaries. While hatching this clandestine counter-revolutionary plot, the group of left communists, with the support of Trotsky, openly attacked the Bolshevik Party, trying to split it and to disintegrate its ranks. But at this grave juncture the party rallied around Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov and supported the Central Committee on the question of peace as on all other questions. The left communist group was isolated and defeated. In order that the party might pronounce its final decision on the question of peace, the Seventh Party Congress was summoned. The Congress opened on March 6, 1918. This was the first Congress held after our party had taken power. It was attended by 46 delegates with vote and 58 delegates with voice but no vote, representing 145,000 party members. Actually, the membership of the party at that time was not less than 270,000. The discrepancy was due to the fact that, owing to the urgency with which the Congress met, a large number of the organizations were unable to send delegates in time, and the organizations in the territories then occupied by the Germans were unable to send delegates at all. Reporting at this Congress on the Brest-Litovsk peace, Lenin said that, the severe crisis which our party is now experiencing, owing to the formation of a left opposition within it, is one of the gravest crises the Russian Revolution has experienced. Lenin, Selected Works. Volume 7, pp. 293-94. The resolution submitted by Lenin on the subject of the Brest-Litovsk peace was adopted by 30 votes against 12, with 4 abstentions. On the day following the adoption of this resolution, Lenin wrote an article entitled, A Distressful Peace, in which he said, "Intolerably severe are the terms of peace. Nevertheless, history will claim its own. Let us set to work to organize, organize and organize. Despite all trials, the future is ours." Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 22, page 288. In its resolution, the Congress declared that further military attacks by imperialist states on the Soviet Republic were inevitable, and that therefore the Congress considered it the fundamental task of the party to adopt the most energetic and resolute measures to strengthen the self-discipline and discipline of the workers and peasants, to prepare the masses for self-sacrificing defense of the socialist country, to organize the Red Army, and to introduce universal military training. Endorsing Lenin's policy with regard to the peace of Brest-Litovsk, the Congress condemned the position of Trotsky and Bukharin and stigmatized the attempt of the defeated left communists to continue their splitting activities at the Congress itself. The peace of Brest-Litovsk gave the party a respite in which to consolidate the Soviet power and to organize the economic life of the country. The peace made it possible to take advantage of the conflicts within the imperialist camp, the war of Austria and Germany with the Entente, which was still in progress, to disintegrate the forces of the enemy, to organize a Soviet economic system and to create a Red Army. The peace made it possible for the proletariat to retain the support of the peasantry and to accumulate strength for the defeat of the White Guard generals in the Civil War. In the period of the October Revolution, Lenin taught the Bolshevik party how to advance fearlessly and resolutely when conditions favored an advance. In the period of the Brest-Litovsk peace, Lenin taught the party how to retreat in good order when the forces of the enemy are obviously superior to our own, in order to prepare with the utmost energy for a new offensive. History has fully proved the correctness of Lenin's line. It was decided at the 7th Congress to change the name of the party and to alter the party program. The name of the party was changed to the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, RCP, B. Lenin proposed to call our party a communist party because this name precisely corresponded to the aim of the party, namely, the achievement of communism. A special commission, which included Lenin and Stalin, was elected to draw up a new party program, Lenin's draft program having been accepted as a basis. Thus, the 7th Congress accomplished a task of profound historical importance. It defeated the enemy hidden within the party's ranks, the left communists and Trotskyites. It succeeded in withdrawing the country from the imperialist war. It secured peace and a respite. It enabled the party to gain time for the organization of the Red Army. And it set the party the task of introducing socialist order in the national economy. 8. Lenin's plan for the initial steps in socialist construction, committees of the poor peasants and the curbing of the kulaks. Revolt of the left socialist revolutionaries and its suppression. 5th Congress of Soviets and adoption of the Constitution of the RSFSR. Having concluded peace and thus gained a respite, the Soviet government set about the work of socialist construction. Lenin called the period from November 1917 to February 1918 the stage of the Red Guard attack on capital. During the first half of 1918, the Soviet government succeeded in breaking the economic might of the bourgeoisie, in concentrating in its own hands the key positions of the national economy: mills, factories, banks, railways, foreign trade, mercantile fleet, etc., smashing the bourgeois machinery of state power, and victoriously crushing the first attempts of the counter-revolution to overthrow the Soviet power. But this was by no means enough. If there was to be progress, the destruction of the old order had to be followed by the building of a new. Accordingly, in the spring of 1918, the transition was begun, from the expropriation of the expropriators, to a new stage of socialist construction, the organizational consolidation of the victories gained, the building of the Soviet national economy. Lenin held that the utmost advantage should be taken of the respite in order to begin to lay the foundation of the socialist economic system. The Bolsheviks had to learn to organize and manage production in a new way. The Bolshevik Party had convinced Russia, Lenin wrote. The Bolshevik Party had wrested Russia for the people from the hands of the rich, and now the Bolsheviks must learn to govern Russia. Lenin held that the chief task at the given stage was to keep account of everything the country produced and to exercise control over the distribution of all products. Petty bourgeois elements predominated in the economic system of the country. The millions of small owners in town and country were a breeding ground for capitalism. These small owners recognized neither labor discipline nor civil discipline. They would not submit to a system of state accounting and control. What was particularly dangerous at this difficult juncture was the petty bourgeois welter of speculation and profiteering, the attempts of the small owners and traders to profit by the people's want. The party started a vigorous war on slovenliness in work, on the absence of labor discipline in industry. The masses were slow in acquiring new habits of labor. The struggle for labor discipline consequently became the major task of the period. Lenin pointed to the necessity of developing socialist emulation in industry, of introducing the piece rate system, of combating wage equalization, of resorting, in addition to methods of education and persuasion, to methods of compulsion with regard to those who wanted to grab as much as possible from the state, with regard to idlers and profiteers. He maintained that the new discipline, the discipline of labor, the discipline of comradely relations, Soviet discipline, was something that would be evolved by the laboring millions in the course of their daily, practical work, and that this task will take up a whole historical epoch. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 7, page 393. All these problems of socialist construction, of the new, socialist relations of production, were dealt with by Lenin in his celebrated work. The immediate tasks of the Soviet government. The left communists, acting in conjunction with the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, fought Lenin over these questions too. Bukharin, Ossinsky and others were opposed to the introduction of discipline, one-man management in the enterprises, the employment of bourgeois experts in industry, and the introduction of efficient business methods. They slandered Lenin by claiming that this policy would mean a return to bourgeois conditions. At the same time, the left communists preached the Trotskyite view that socialist construction and the victory of socialism in Russia were impossible. The left phraseology of the left communists served to camouflage their defense of the kulaks, idlers and profiteers who were opposed to discipline and hostile to the state regulation of economic life, to accounting and control. Having settled on the principles of organization of the new, Soviet industry, the party proceeded to tackle the problems of the countryside, which at this period was in the throes of a struggle between the poor peasants and the kulaks. The kulaks were gaining strength and seizing the lands confiscated from the landlords. The poor peasants needed assistance. The kulaks fought the proletarian government and refused to sell grain to it at fixed prices. They wanted to starve the Soviet state into renouncing socialist measures. The party set the task of smashing the counter-revolutionary kulaks. Detachments of industrial workers were sent into the countryside with the object of organizing the poor peasants and ensuring the success of the struggle against the kulaks, who were holding back their grain surpluses. Comrades, workers, remember that the revolution is in a critical situation, Lenin wrote. Remember that you alone can save the revolution, nobody else. What we need is tens of thousands of picked, politically advanced workers, loyal to the cause of socialism, incapable of succumbing to bribery and the temptations of pilfering, and capable of creating an iron force against the kulaks, profiteers, marauders, bribers and disorganizers. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 23, page 25. The struggle for bread is a struggle for socialism, Lenin said. And it was under this slogan that the sending of workers' detachments to the rural districts was organized. A number of decrees were issued establishing a food dictatorship and conferring emergency powers on the organs of the People's Commissariat of Food for the purchase of grain at fixed prices. A decree was issued on June 11, 1918, providing for the creation of committees of the poor peasants. These committees played an important part in the struggle against the kulaks, in the redistribution of the confiscated land and the distribution of agricultural implements, in the collection of food surpluses from the kulaks, and in the supply of foodstuffs to the working-class centers and the Red Army. 50 million hectares of kulak land passed into the hands of the poor and middle peasants. A large portion of the kulaks' means of production was confiscated and turned over to the poor peasants. The formation of the committees of the poor peasants was a further stage in the development of the socialist revolution in the countryside. The committees were strongholds of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the villages. It was largely through them that enlistment for the Red Army was carried out among the peasants. The proletarian campaign in the rural districts and the organization of the committees of the poor peasants consolidated the Soviet power in the countryside and were of tremendous political importance in winning over the middle peasants to the side of the Soviet government. At the end of 1918, when their task had been completed, the committees of the poor peasants were merged with the rural Soviets and their existence was thus terminated. At the Fifth Congress of Soviets, which opened on July 4, 1918, the left socialist revolutionaries launched a fierce attack on Lenin in defense of the kulaks. They demanded the discontinuation of the fight against the kulaks and of the dispatch of workers' food detachments into the countryside. When the left socialist revolutionaries saw that the majority of the Congress was firmly opposed to their policy, they started a revolt in Moscow and seized Tryoksvititelsky Alley, from which they began to shell the Kremlin. This foolhardy outbreak was put down by the Bolsheviks within a few hours. Attempts at revolt were made by left socialist revolutionaries in other parts of the country, but everywhere these outbreaks were speedily suppressed. As the trial of the anti-Soviet bloc of rights and Trotskyites has now established, the revolt of the left socialist revolutionaries was started with the knowledge and consent of Bukharin and Trotsky and was part of a general counter-revolutionary conspiracy of the Bukharinites, Trotskyites and left socialist revolutionaries against the Soviet power. At this juncture, too, a left socialist revolutionary by name of Blumkin, afterwards an agent of Trotsky, made his way into the German embassy and assassinated Murbach, the German ambassador in Moscow, with the object of provoking a war with Germany. But the Soviet government managed to avert war and to frustrate the provocateur designs of the counter-revolutionaries. The Fifth Congress of Soviets adopted the first Soviet constitution, the Constitution of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. BRIEFSUMMARY. During the 8 months, February to October 1917, the Bolshevik Party accomplished the very difficult task of winning over the majority of the working class and the majority in the Soviets, and enlisting the support of millions of peasants for the socialist revolution. It wrested these masses from the influence of the petty bourgeois parties, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks and anarchists, by exposing the policy of these parties step by step and showing that it ran counter to the interests of the working people. The Bolshevik Party carried on extensive political, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution work at the front and in the rear, preparing the masses for the October Socialist Revolution. The events of decisive importance in the history of the party at this period were Lenin's arrival from exile abroad, his April theses, the April Party Conference and the Sixth Party Congress. The party decisions were a source of strength to the working class and inspired it with confidence in victory. In them the workers found solutions to the important problems of the revolution. The April Conference directed the efforts of the party to the struggle for the transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution. The Sixth Congress headed the party for an armed uprising against the bourgeoisie and its provisional government. The compromising socialist revolutionary and Menshevik parties, the anarchists, and the other non-communist parties completed the cycle of their development. They all became bourgeois parties even before the October Revolution and fought for the preservation and integrity of the capitalist system. The Bolshevik Party was the only party which led the struggle of the masses for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the establishment of the power of the Soviets. At the same time, the Bolsheviks defeated the attempts of the capitulators within the party, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rykov, Bukharin, Trotsky and Pyatakov, to deflect the party from the path of socialist revolution. Headed by the Bolshevik Party, the working class, in alliance with the poor peasants, and with the support of the soldiers and sailors, overthrew the power of the bourgeoisie, established the power of the Soviets, set up a new type of state, a socialist Soviet state, abolished the landlord's ownership of land, turned over the land to the peasants for their use, nationalized all the land in the country, expropriated the capitalists, achieved the withdrawal of Russia from the war and obtained peace, that is, obtained a much-needed respite, and thus created the conditions for the development of socialist construction. The October Socialist Revolution smashed capitalism, deprived the bourgeoisie of the means of production and converted the mills, factories, land, railways and banks into the property of the whole people, into public property. It established the dictatorship of the proletariat and turned over the government of the vast country to the working class, thus making it the ruling class. The October Socialist Revolution thereby ushered in a new era in the history of mankind, the era of proletarian revolutions. CHAPTEREIGHT. The Bolshevik Party in the period of foreign military intervention and civil war. 1918-1920. 1. Beginning of foreign military intervention. First period of the Civil War. The conclusion of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk and the consolidation of the Soviet power, as a result of a series of revolutionary economic measures adopted by it, at a time when the war in the West was still in full swing, created profound alarm among the Western imperialists, especially those of the Entente countries. The Entente imperialists feared that the conclusion of peace between Germany and Russia might improve Germany's position in the war and correspondingly worsen the position of their own armies. They feared, moreover, that peace between Russia and Germany might stimulate the craving for peace in all countries and on all fronts, and thus interfere with the prosecution of the war and damage the cause of the imperialists. Lastly, they feared that the existence of a Soviet government on the territory of a vast country, and the success it had achieved at home after the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie, might serve as an infectious example for the workers and soldiers of the West. Profoundly discontented with the protracted war, the workers and soldiers might follow in the footsteps of the Russians and turn their bayonets against their masters and oppressors. Consequently, the Entente governments decided to intervene in Russia by armed force with the object of overthrowing the Soviet government and establishing a bourgeois government, which would restore the bourgeois system in the country, annul the peace treaty with the Germans and re-establish the military front against Germany and Austria. The Entente imperialists launched upon this sinister enterprise all the more readily because they were convinced that the Soviet government was unstable. They had no doubt that with some effort on the part of its enemies its early fall would be inevitable. The achievements of the Soviet government and its consolidation created even greater alarm among the deposed classes, the landlords 225 and capitalists. In the ranks of the vanquished parties, the constitutional Democrats, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, anarchists and the bourgeois nationalists of all hues, and among the White Guard generals, Cossack officers, etc. From the very first days of the victorious October Revolution, all these hostile elements began to shout from the housetops that there was no ground in Russia for a Soviet power, that it was doomed, that it was bound to fall within a week or two, or a month, or 2 or 3 months at most. But as the Soviet government, despite the imprecations of its enemies, continued to exist and gain strength, its foes within Russia were forced to admit that it was much stronger than they had imagined, and that its overthrow would require great efforts and a fierce struggle on the part of all the forces of counter-revolution. They therefore decided to embark upon counter-revolutionary insurrectionary activities on a broad scale, to mobilize the forces of counter-revolution, to assemble military cadres and to organize revolts, especially in the Cossack and Kulak districts. Thus, already in the first half of 1918, 2 definite forces took shape that were prepared to embark upon the overthrow of the Soviet power, namely, the foreign imperialists of the Entente and the counter-revolutionaries at home. Neither of these forces possessed all the requisites needed to undertake the overthrow of the Soviet government singly. The counter-revolutionaries in Russia had certain military cadres and manpower, drawn principally from the upper classes of the Cossacks and from the Kulaks, enough to start a rebellion against the Soviet government. But they possessed neither money nor arms. The foreign imperialists, on the other hand, had the money and the arms, but could not release a sufficient number of troops for purposes of intervention. They could not do so, not only because these troops were required for the war with Germany and Austria, but because they might not prove altogether reliable in a war against the Soviet power. The conditions of the struggle against the Soviet power dictated a union of the 2 anti-Soviet forces, foreign and domestic. And this union was effected in the first half of 1918. This was how the foreign military intervention against the Soviet power supported by counter-revolutionary revolts of its foes at home originated. This was the end of the respite in Russia and the beginning of the Civil War, which was a war of the workers and peasants of the nations of Russia against the foreign and domestic enemies of the Soviet power. The imperialists of Great Britain, France, Japan and America started their military intervention without any declaration of war, although the intervention was a war against Russia, and the worst kind of war at that. These civilized marauders secretly and stealthily made their way to Russian shores and landed their troops on Russia's territory. The British and French landed troops in the north, occupied Archangel and Murmansk, supported a local White Guard revolt, overthrew the Soviets and set up a white government of North Russia. The Japanese landed troops in Vladivostok, seized the maritime province, dispersed the Soviets and supported the White Guard rebels, who subsequently restored the bourgeois system. In the North Caucasus, Generals Kornilov, Alexeyev and Denikin, with the support of the British and French, formed a White Guard volunteer army, raised a revolt of the upper classes of the Cossacks and started hostilities against the Soviets. On the Don, Generals Krasnov and Mamontov, with the secret support of the German imperialists, the Germans hesitated to support them openly owing to the peace treaty between Germany and Russia, raised a revolt of Don Cossacks, occupied the Don region and started hostilities against the Soviets. In the Middle Volga region and in Siberia, the British and French instigated a revolt of the Czechoslovak Corps. This corps, which consisted of prisoners of war, had received permission from the Soviet government to return home through Siberia and the Far East. But on the way it was used by the socialist revolutionaries and by the British and French for a revolt against the Soviet government. The revolt of the corps served as a signal for a revolt of the kulaks in the Volga region and in Siberia, and of the workers of the Votkinsk and Izhevsk works, who were under the influence of the socialist revolutionaries. A White Guard socialist revolutionary government was set up in the Volga region, in Samara, and a White Guard government of Siberia, in Omsk. Germany took no part in the intervention of this British-French-Japanese-American bloc, nor could she do so, since she was at war with this bloc if for no other reason. But in spite of this, and notwithstanding the existence of a peace treaty between Russia and Germany, no Bolshevik doubted that Kaiser Wilhelm's government was just as rabid an enemy of Soviet Russia as the British-French-Japanese-American invaders. And, indeed, the German imperialists did their utmost to isolate, weaken and destroy Soviet Russia. They snatched from it the Ukraine. True, it was in accordance with a treaty with the White Guard. Ukrainian Rada Council brought in their troops at the request of the Rada and began mercilessly to rob and oppress the Ukrainian people, forbidding them to maintain any connections whatever with Soviet Russia. They severed Transcaucasia from Soviet Russia, sent German and Turkish troops there at the request of the Georgian and Azerbaijan nationalists and began to play the masters in Tiflis and in Baku. They supplied, not openly, it is true, abundant arms and provisions to General Krasnov, who had raised a revolt against the Soviet government on the Don. Soviet Russia was thus cut off from her principal sources of food, raw material and fuel. Conditions were hard in Soviet Russia at that period. There was a shortage of bread and meat. The workers were starving. In Moscow and Petrograd a bread ration of 1/8 of a pound was issued to them every other day, and there were times when no bread was issued at all. The factories were at a standstill, or almost at a standstill, owing to a lack of raw materials and fuel. But the working class did not lose heart. Nor did the Bolshevik Party. The desperate struggle waged to overcome the incredible difficulties of that period showed how inexhaustible is the energy latent in the working class and how immense the prestige of the Bolshevik Party. The party proclaimed the country an armed camp and placed its economic, cultural and political life on a war footing. The Soviet government announced that the socialist fatherland is in danger, and called upon the people to rise in its defense. Lenin issued the slogan, "All for the front," and hundreds of thousands of workers and peasants volunteered for service in the Red Army and left for the front. About half the membership of the party and of the Young Communist League went to the front. The party roused the people for a war for the fatherland, a war against the foreign invaders and against the revolts of the exploiting classes whom the revolution had overthrown. The Council of Workers' and Peasants' Defense, organized by Lenin, directed the work of supplying the front with reinforcements, food, clothing and arms. The substitution of compulsory military service for the volunteer system brought hundreds of thousands of new recruits into the Red Army and very shortly raised its strength to over 1 million men. Although the country was in a difficult position and the young Red Army was not yet consolidated, the measures of defense adopted soon yielded their first fruits. General Krasnov was forced back from Tsaritsyn, whose capture he had regarded as certain, and driven beyond the River Don. General Denikin's operations were localized within a small area in the North Caucasus, while General Kornilov was killed in action against the Red Army. The Czechoslovaks and the White Guard socialist revolutionary bands were ousted from Kazan, Simbirsk and Samara and driven to the Urals. A revolt in Yaroslavl headed by the White Guard Savinkov and organized by Lockhart, chief of the British mission in Moscow, was suppressed, and Lockhart himself arrested. The socialist revolutionaries, who had assassinated comrades Uritsky and Volodarsky and had made a villainous attempt on the life of Lenin, were subjected to a Red Terror in retaliation for their White Terror against the Bolsheviks, and were completely routed in every important city in central Russia. The young Red Army matured and hardened in battle. The work of the Communist commissars was of decisive importance in the consolidation and political education of the Red Army and in raising its discipline and fighting efficiency. But the Bolshevik Party knew that these were only the first, not the decisive successes of the Red Army. It was aware that new and far more serious battles were still to come, and that the country could recover the lost food, raw material and fuel regions only by a prolonged and stubborn struggle with the enemy. The Bolsheviks therefore undertook intense preparations for a protracted war and decided to place the whole country at the service of the front. The Soviet government introduced war communism. It took under its control the middle-sized and small industries, in addition to large-scale industry, so as to accumulate goods for the supply of the army and the agricultural population. It introduced a state monopoly of the grain trade, prohibited private trading in grain and established the surplus appropriation system, under which all surplus produce in the hands of the peasants was to be registered and acquired by the state at fixed prices, so as to accumulate stores of grain for the provisioning of the army and the workers. Lastly, it introduced universal labor service for all classes. By making physical labor compulsory for the bourgeoisie and thus releasing workers for other duties of greater importance to the front, the party was giving practical effect to the principle, "He who does not work, neither shall he eat." All these measures, which were necessitated by the exceptionally difficult conditions of national defense, and bore a temporary character, were in their entirety known as war communism. The country prepared itself for a long and exacting civil war, for a war against the foreign and internal enemies of the Soviet power. By the end of 1918 it had to increase the strength of the army threefold, and to accumulate supplies for this army. Lenin said at that time, "We had decided to have an army of 1 million men by the spring, now we need an army of 3 million. We can get it. And we will get it, too." Defeat of Germany in the war. Revolution in Germany. Founding of the Third International, 8th Party Congress. While the Soviet country was preparing for new battles against the forces of foreign intervention, in the West decisive events were taking place in the belligerent countries, both on the war fronts and in their interior. Germany and Austria were suffocating in the grip of war and a food crisis. Whereas Great Britain, France and the United States were continually drawing upon new resources, Germany and Austria were consuming their last meager stocks. The situation was such that Germany and Austria, having reached the stage of extreme exhaustion, were on the brink of defeat. At the same time, the peoples of Germany and Austria were seething with indignation against the disastrous and interminable war, and against their imperialist governments who had reduced them to a state of exhaustion and starvation. The revolutionary influence of the October Revolution also had a tremendous effect, as did the fraternization of the Soviet soldiers with the Austrian and German soldiers at the front even before the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, the actual termination of the war with Soviet Russia and the conclusion of peace with her. The people of Russia had brought about the end of the detested war by overthrowing their imperialist government, and this could not but serve as an object lesson to the Austrian and German workers. And the German soldiers who had been stationed on the Eastern Front and who after the Peace of Brest-Litovsk were transferred to the Western Front could not but undermine the morale of the German army on that front by their accounts of the fraternization with the Soviet soldiers and of the way the Soviet soldiers had got rid of the war. The disintegration of the Austrian army from the same causes had begun even earlier. All this served to accentuate the craving for peace among the German soldiers. They lost their former fighting efficiency and began to retreat in face of the onslaught of the Entente armies. In November 1918 a revolution broke out in Germany, and Wilhelm and his government were overthrown. Germany was obliged to acknowledge defeat and to sue for peace. Thus at one stroke Germany was reduced from a first-rate power to a second-rate power. As far as the position of the Soviet government was concerned, this circumstance had certain disadvantages, inasmuch as it made the Entente countries, which had started armed intervention against the Soviet power, the dominant force in Europe and Asia, and enabled them to intervene more actively in the Soviet country and to blockade her, to draw the noose more tightly around the Soviet power. And this was what actually happened, as we shall see later. On the other hand, it had its advantages, which outweighed the disadvantages and fundamentally improved the position of Soviet Russia. In the first place, the Soviet government was now able to annul the predatory Peace of Brest-Litovsk, to stop paying the indemnities, and to start an open struggle, military and political, for the liberation of Estonia, Latvia, Byelorussia, Lithuania, the Ukraine and Transcaucasia from the yoke of German imperialism. Secondly, and chiefly, the existence in the center of Europe, in Germany, of a republican regime and of Soviets of workers in soldiers' deputies was bound to revolutionize, and actually did revolutionize, the countries of Europe, and this could not but strengthen the position of the Soviet power in Russia. True, the revolution in Germany was not a socialist but a bourgeois revolution, and the Soviets were an obedient tool of the bourgeois parliament, for they were dominated by the Social Democrats, who were compromisers of the type of the Russian Mensheviks. This in fact explains the weakness of the German Revolution. How weak it really was is shown, for example, by the fact that it allowed the German White Guards to assassinate such prominent revolutionaries as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht with impunity. Nevertheless, it was a revolution. Wilhelm had been overthrown, and the workers had cast off their chains, and this in itself was bound to unloose the revolution in the West, was bound to call forth a rise in the revolution in the European countries. The tide of revolution in Europe began to mount. A revolutionary movement started in Austria, and a Soviet republic arose in Hungary. With the rising tide of the revolution, communist parties came to the surface. A real basis now existed for a union of the communist parties, for the formation of the Third Communist International. In March 1919, on the initiative of the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, the first Congress of the Communist Parties of various countries, held in Moscow, founded the Communist International. Although many of The delegates were prevented by the blockade and imperialist persecution from arriving in Moscow. The most important countries of Europe and America were represented at this first Congress. The work of the Congress was guided by Lenin. Lenin reported on the subject of bourgeois democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat. He brought out the importance of the Soviet system, showing that it meant genuine democracy for the working people. The Congress adopted a manifesto to the proletariat of all countries calling upon them to wage a determined struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat and for the triumph of Soviets all over the world. The Congress set up an executive committee of the Third Communist International, ECCI. Thus was founded an international revolutionary proletarian organization of a new type, the Communist International, the Marxist-Leninist International. The 8th Congress of our party met in March 1919. It assembled in the midst of a conflict of contradictory factors. On the one hand, the reactionary bloc of the Entente countries against the Soviet government had grown stronger, and, on the other, the rising tide of revolution in Europe, especially in the defeated countries, had considerably improved the position of the Soviet country. The Congress was attended by 301 delegates with vote, representing 313,766 members of the party, and 102 delegates with voice but no vote. In his inaugural speech, Lenin paid homage to the memory of Y.M. Sverdlov, one of the finest organizing talents in the Bolshevik Party, who had died on the eve of the Congress. The Congress adopted a new party program. This program gives a description of capitalism and of its highest phase, imperialism. It compares two systems of state, the bourgeois democratic system and the Soviet system. It details the specific tasks of the party in the struggle for socialism, completion of the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, administration of the economic life of the country in accordance with a single socialist plan, participation of the trade unions in the organization of the national economy, socialist labor discipline, utilization of bourgeois experts in the economic field under the control of Soviet bodies, gradual and systematic enlistment of the middle peasantry in the work of socialist construction. Gress. Lenin considered it essential that the program should take account of the complexity of our economic system and note the existence of diverse economic formations in the country, including small commodity production, as represented by the middle peasants. Therefore, during the debate on the program, Lenin vigorously condemned the anti-Bolshevik views of Bukharin, who proposed that the clauses dealing with capitalism, small commodity production, the economy of the middle peasant, be left out of the program. Bukharin's views represented a Menshevik Trotskyite denial of the role played by the middle peasant in the development of the Soviet state. Furthermore, Bukharin glossed over the fact that the small commodity production of the peasants bred and nourished kulak elements. Lenin further refuted the anti-Bolshevik views of Bukharin and Pyatakov on the national question. They spoke against the inclusion in the program of a clause on the right of nations to self-determination. They were against the equality of nations, claiming that it was a slogan that would hinder the victory of the proletarian revolution and the union of the proletarians of different nationalities. Lenin overthrew these utterly pernicious, imperialist, chauvinist views of Bukharin and Pyatakov. An important place in the deliberations of the 8th Congress was devoted to policy towards the middle peasants. The decree on the land had resulted in a steady growth in the number of middle peasants, who now comprised the majority of the peasant population. The attitude and conduct of the middle peasantry, which vacillated between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was of momentous importance for the fate of the Civil War and socialist construction. The outcome of the Civil War largely depended on which way the middle peasant would swing, which class would win his allegiance, the proletariat or the bourgeoisie. The Czechoslovaks, the White Guards, the kulaks, the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks were able to overthrow the Soviet power in the Volga region in the summer of 1918 because they were supported by a large section of the middle peasantry. The same was true during the revolts raised by the kulaks in central Russia. But in the autumn of 1918 the mass of the middle peasants began to swing over to the Soviet power. The peasants saw that victories of the whites were followed by the restoration of the power of the landlords, the seizure of peasants' land, and the robbery, flogging and torture of peasants. The activities of the committees of the poor peasants, which crushed the kulaks, also contributed to the change in the attitude of the peasantry. Accordingly, in November 1918, Lenin issued the slogan, "Learn to come to an agreement with the middle peasant, while not for a moment renouncing the struggle against the kulak and at the same time firmly relying solely on the poor peasant." Lenin. Selected Works, Volume 8, page 150. Of course, the middle peasants did not cease to vacillate entirely, but they drew closer to the Soviet government and began to support it more solidly. This to a large extent was facilitated by the policy towards the middle peasants laid down by the 8th Party Congress. The 8th Congress marked a turning point in the policy of the party towards the middle peasants. Lenin's report and the decisions of the Congress laid down a new line of the party on this question. The Congress demanded that the party organizations and all communists should draw a strict distinction and division between the middle peasant and the kulak, and should strive to win the former over to the side of the working class by paying close attention to his needs. The backwardness of the middle peasants had to be overcome by persuasion and not by compulsion and coercion. The Congress therefore gave instructions that no compulsion be used in the carrying out of socialist measures in the countryside, formation of communes and agricultural artels. In all cases affecting the vital interests of the middle peasant, a practical agreement should be reached with him and concessions made with regard to the methods of realizing socialist changes. The Congress laid down the policy of a stable alliance with the middle peasant, the leading role in this alliance to be maintained by the proletariat. The new policy towards the middle peasant proclaimed by Lenin at the 8th Congress required that the proletariat should rely on the poor peasant, maintain a stable alliance with the middle peasant and fight the kulak. The policy of the party before the 8th Congress was in general one of neutralizing the middle peasant. This meant that the party strove to prevent the middle peasant from siding with the kulak and with the bourgeoisie in general. But now this was not enough. The 8th Congress passed from a policy of neutralization of the middle peasant to a policy of stable alliance with him for the purpose of the struggle against the White Guards and foreign intervention and for the successful building of socialism. The policy adopted by the Congress towards the middle peasants, who formed the bulk of the peasantry, played a decisive part in ensuring success in the civil war against foreign intervention and its White Guard henchmen. In the autumn of 1919, when the peasants had to choose between the Soviet power and Denikin, they supported the Soviets, and the proletarian dictatorship was able to vanquish its most dangerous enemy. The problems connected with the building up of the Red Army held a special place in the deliberations of the Congress, where the so-called military opposition appeared in the field. This military opposition comprised quite a number of former members of the now shattered group of left communists, but it also included some party workers who had never participated in any opposition, but were dissatisfied with the way Trotsky was conducting the affairs of the army. The majority of the delegates from the army were distinctly hostile to Trotsky. They resented his veneration for the military experts of the old Tsarist army, some of whom were betraying us outright in the Civil War, and his arrogant and hostile attitude towards the old Bolshevik cadres in the army. Instances of Trotsky's practices were cited at the Congress. For example, he had attempted to shoot a number of prominent army communists serving at the front, just because they had incurred his displeasure. This was directly playing into the hands of the enemy. It was only the intervention of the Central Committee and the protests of military men that saved the lives of these comrades. But while fighting Trotsky's distortions of the military policy of the party, the military opposition held incorrect views on a number of points concerning the building up of the army. Lenin and Stalin vigorously came out against the military opposition because the latter defended the survivals of the guerrilla spirit and resisted the creation of a regular Red Army, the utilization of the military experts of the old army and the establishment of that iron discipline without which no army can be a real army. Comrade Stalin rebutted the military opposition and demanded the creation of a regular army inspired with the spirit of strictest discipline. He said, "Either we create a real worker and peasant, primarily a peasant, army, strictly disciplined army, and defend the republic, or we perish." While rejecting a number of proposals made by the military opposition, the Congress dealt a blow at Trotsky by demanding an improvement in the work of the central military institutions and the enhancement of the role of the communists in the army. A military commission was set up at the Congress. Thanks to its efforts, the decision on the military question was adopted by the Congress unanimously. The effect of this decision was to strengthen the Red Army and to bring it still closer to the party. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. The Congress further discussed party and Soviet affairs and the guiding role of the party in the Soviets. During the debate on the latter question, the Congress repudiated the view of the opportunist Sapranov-Ossinsky group, which held that the party should not guide the work of the Soviets. Lastly, in view of the huge influx of new members into the party, the Congress outlined measures to improve the social composition of the party and decided to conduct a re-registration of its members. This initiated the first purge of the party ranks. 3. Extension of intervention. Blockade of the Soviet country. Kolchak's campaign and defeat. Denikin's campaign and defeat. A 3 months respite. 9th Party Congress. Having vanquished Germany and Austria, the Entente states decided to hurl large military forces against the Soviet country. After Germany's defeat and the evacuation of her troops from the Ukraine and Transcaucasia, her place was taken by the British and French, who dispatched their fleets to the Black Sea and landed troops in Odessa and in Transcaucasia. Such was the brutality of the Entente forces of intervention that they did not hesitate to shoot whole batches of workers and peasants in the occupied regions. Their outrages reached such lengths in the end that after the occupation of Turkestan they carried off to the Transcaspian region 26 leading Baku Bolsheviks, including comrades Shamyan, Fyolatov, Japaridze, Malygin, Azizbekov, Korganov, and with the aid of the socialist revolutionaries, had them brutally shot. The interventionists soon proclaimed a blockade of Russia. All sea routes and other lines of communication with the external world were cut. The Soviet country was surrounded on nearly every side. The Entente countries placed their chief hopes in Admiral Kolchak, their puppet in Omsk, Siberia. He was proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia, and all the counter-revolutionary forces in the country placed themselves under his command. The Eastern Front thus became the main front. Kolchak assembled a huge army and in the spring of 1919 almost reached the Volga. The finest Bolshevik forces were hurled against him. Young communist leaguers and workers were mobilized. In April 1919, Kolchak's army met with severe defeat at the hands of the Red Army and very soon began to retreat along the whole front. At the height of the advance of the Red Army on the Eastern Front, Trotsky put forward a suspicious plan. He proposed that the advance should be halted before it reached the Urals. The pursuit of Kolchak's army discontinued, and troops transferred from the Eastern Front to the Southern Front. The Central Committee of the party fully realized that the Urals and Siberia could not be left in Kolchak's hands, for there, with the aid of the Japanese and British, he might recuperate and retrieve his former position. It therefore rejected this plan and gave instructions to proceed with the advance. Trotsky disagreed with these instructions and tendered his resignation, which the Central Committee declined, at the same time ordering him to refrain at once from all participation in the direction of the operations on the Eastern Front. The Red Army pursued its offensive against Kolchak with greater vigor than ever. It inflicted a number of new defeats on him and freed of the Whites the Urals and Siberia, where the Red Army was supported by a powerful partisan movement in the Whites' rear. In the summer of 1919, the imperialists assigned to General Yudenich, who headed the counter-revolutionaries in the northwest, in the Baltic countries, in the vicinity of Petrograd, the task of diverting the attention of the Red Army from the Eastern Front by an attack on Petrograd. Influenced by the counter-revolutionary agitation of former officers, the garrisons of two forts in the vicinity of Petrograd mutinied against the Soviet government. At the same time, a counter-revolutionary plot was discovered at the front headquarters. The enemy threatened Petrograd, but thanks to the measures taken by the Soviet government with the support of the workers and sailors, the mutinous forts were cleared of Whites, and Yudenich's troops were defeated and driven back into Estonia. The defeat of Yudenich near Petrograd made it easier to cope with Kolchak, and by the end of 1919 his army was completely routed. Kolchak himself was taken prisoner and shot by sentence of the Revolutionary Committee in Irkutsk. That was the end of Kolchak. The Siberians had a popular song about Kolchak at that time. Uniform British, epaulettes from France, Japanese tobacco, Kolchak leads the dance, uniform in tatters, epaulettes all gone, so is the tobacco, Kolchak's day is done. Since Kolchak had not justified their hopes, the interventionists altered their plan of attack on the Soviet Republic. The troops landed in Odessa had to be withdrawn, for contact with the army of the Soviet Republic had infected them with the revolutionary spirit and they were beginning to rebel against their imperialist masters. For example, there was the revolt of French sailors in Odessa led by André Marty. Accordingly, now that Kolchak had been defeated, the Entente centered its attention on General Denikin, Kornilov's confederate and the organizer of the Volunteer Army. Denikin at that time was operating against the Soviet government in the south, in the Kuban region. The Entente supplied his army with large quantities of ammunition and equipment and sent it north against the Soviet government. The Southern Front now became the chief front. Denikin began his main campaign against the Soviet government in the summer of 1919. Trotsky had disrupted the Southern Front, and our troops suffered defeat after defeat. By the middle of October the Whites had seized the whole of the Ukraine, had captured Oryol and were nearing Tula, which supplied our army with cartridges, rifles and machine guns. The Whites were approaching Moscow. The situation of the Soviet Republic became grave in the extreme. The party sounded the alarm and called upon the people to resist. Lenin issued the slogan, "All for the fight against Denikin." Inspired by the Bolsheviks, the workers and peasants mustered all their forces to smash the enemy. The Central Committee sent comrades Stalin, Voroshilov, Orjonikidze and Budyonny to the Southern Front to prepare the rout of Denikin. Trotsky was removed from the direction of the operations of the Red Army in the south. Before Comrade Stalin's arrival, the command of the Southern Front, in conjunction with Trotsky, had drawn up a plan to strike the main blow at Denikin from Tsaritsyn in the direction of Novorossiysk, through the Don Steppe, where there were no roads and where the Red Army would have to pass through regions inhabited by Cossacks, who were at that time largely under the influence of the White Guards. Comrade Stalin severely criticized this plan and submitted to the Central Committee his own plan for the defeat of Denikin. According to this plan, the main blow was to be delivered by way of Kharkiv, Donetsk Basin, Rostov. This plan would ensure the rapid advance of our troops against Denikin, for they would be moving through working class and peasant regions where they would have the open sympathy of the population. Furthermore, the dense network of railway lines in this region would ensure our armies the regular supply of all they required. Lastly, this plan would make it possible to release the Donetsk coal basin and thus supply our country with fuel. The Central Committee of the party accepted Comrade Stalin's plan. In the second half of October 1919, after fierce resistance, Denikin was defeated by the Red Army in the decisive battles of Orel and Voronezh. He began a rapid retreat and, pursued by our forces, fled to the south. At the beginning of 1920, the whole of the Ukraine and the North Caucasus had been cleared of whites. During the decisive battles on the southern front, the imperialists again hurled Yudench's corps against Petrograd in order to divert our forces from the south and thus improve the position of Denikin's army. The whites approached the very gates of Petrograd. The heroic proletariat of the premier city of the revolution rose in a solid wall for its defense. The communists, as always, were in the vanguard. After fierce fighting, the whites were defeated and again flung beyond our borders back into Estonia. And that was the end of Denikin. The defeat of Kolchak and Denikin was followed by a brief respite. When the imperialists saw that the White Guard armies had been smashed, that intervention had failed, and that the Soviet government was consolidating its position all over the country, while in Western Europe the indignation of the workers against military intervention in the Soviet Republic was rising, they began to change their attitude towards the Soviet state. In January 1920, Great Britain, France, and Italy decided to call off the blockade of Soviet Russia. This was an important breach in the wall of intervention. It did not, of course, mean that the Soviet country was done with intervention and the Civil War. There was still the danger of attack by imperialist Poland. The forces of intervention had not yet been finally driven out of the Far East, Transcaucasia and the Crimea. But Soviet Russia had secured a temporary breathing space and was able to divert more forces to economic development. The party could now devote its attention to economic problems. During the Civil War, many skilled workers had left industry owing to the closing down of mills and factories. The party now took measures to return them to industry to work at their trades. The railways were in a grave condition and several thousand communists were assigned to the work of restoring them, for unless this was done the restoration of the major branches of industry could not be seriously undertaken. The organization of the food supply was extended and improved. The drafting of a plan for the electrification of Russia was begun. Nearly 5 million Red Army men were under arms and could not be demobilized owing to the danger of war. A part of the Red Army was therefore converted into labor armies and used in the economic field. The Council of Workers and Peasants' Defense was transformed into the Council of Labor and Defense, and a state planning commission, Gosplan, set up to assist it. Such was the situation when the Ninth Party Congress opened. The Congress met at the end of March 1920. It was attended by 554 delegates with vote, representing 611,978 party members, and 162 delegates with voice but no vote. The Congress defined the immediate tasks of the country in the sphere of transportation and industry. It particularly stressed the necessity of the trade unions taking part in the building up of the economic life. Special attention was devoted by the Congress to a single economic plan for the restoration, in the first place, of the railways, the fuel industry and the iron and steel industry. The major item in this plan was a project for the electrification of the country, which Lenin advanced as a great program for the next 10 or 20 years. This formed the basis of the famous plan of the State Commission for the Electrification of Russia, GOELRO, the provisions of which have today been far exceeded. The Congress rejected the views of an anti-party group which called itself the Group of Democratic Centralism, and was opposed to one-man management and the undivided responsibility of industrial directors. It advocated unrestricted, group management, under which nobody would be personally responsible for the administration of industry. The chief figures in this anti-party group were Sapernov, Ossinsky and Y. Smirnov. They were supported at the Congress by Rykov and Tomsky. 4. Polish gentry attacks Soviet Russia. General Wrangel's campaign. Failure of the Polish plan. Rout of Wrangel. End of the intervention. Notwithstanding the defeat of Kolchak and Denikin, notwithstanding the fact that the Soviet Republic was steadily regaining its territory by clearing the whites and the forces of intervention out of the northern territory, Turkestan, Siberia, the Don region, the Ukraine, etc., notwithstanding the fact that the Entente states were obliged to call off the blockade of Russia, they still refused to reconcile themselves to the idea that the Soviet power had proved impregnable and had come out victorious. They therefore resolved to make one more attempt at intervention in Soviet Russia. This time they decided to utilize both Pilsudski, a bourgeois counter-revolutionary nationalist, the virtual head of the Polish state, and General Wrangel, who had rallied the remnants of Denikin's army in the Crimea and from there was threatening the Donets Basin and the Ukraine. The Polish gentry and Wrangel, as Lenin put it, were the two hands with which international imperialism attempted to strangle Soviet Russia. The plan of the Poles was to seize the Soviet Ukraine west of the Dnieper, to occupy Soviet Byelorussia, to restore the power of the Polish magnates in these regions, to extend the frontiers of the Polish state so that they stretch from sea to sea, from Danzig to Odessa, and, in return for his aid, to help Wrangel smash the Red Army and restore the power of the landlords and capitalists in Soviet Russia. This plan was approved by the Entente states. The Soviet government made vain attempts to enter into negotiations with Poland with the object of preserving peace and averting war. Pilsudski refused to discuss peace. He wanted war. He calculated that the Red Army, fatigued by its battles with Kolchak and Denikin, would not be able to withstand the attack of the Polish forces. The short breathing space had come to an end. In April 1920, the Poles invaded the Soviet Ukraine and seized Kiev. At the same time, Wrangel took the offensive and threatened the Donets Basin. In reply, the Red Army started a counter-offensive against the Poles along the whole front. Kiev was recaptured and the Polish warlords driven out of the Ukraine and Byelorussia. The impetuous advance of the Red troops on the southern front brought them to the very gates of Lvov in Galicia, while the troops on the western front were nearing Warsaw. The Polish armies were on the verge of utter defeat. But success was frustrated by the suspicious actions of Trotsky and his followers at the general headquarters of the Red Army. Through the fault of Trotsky and Tukhachevsky, the advance of the Red troops on the western front, towards Warsaw, proceeded in an absolutely unorganized manner. The troops were allowed no opportunity to consolidate the positions that they won. The advanced detachments were led too far ahead, while reserves and ammunition were left too far in the rear. Tion and reserves in the front was stretched out endlessly. This made it easy to force a breach in the front. The result was that when a small force of Poles broke through our western front at one point, our troops, left without ammunition, were obliged to retreat. As regards the troops on the southern front, who had reached the gates of Lvov and were pressing the Poles hard, they were forbidden by Trotsky, that ill-famed chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council, to capture Lvov. He ordered the transfer of the mounted army, the main force on the southern front, far to the northeast. This was done on the pretext of helping the Western Front, although it was not difficult to see that the best, and in fact only possible, way of helping the Western Front was to capture Lvov. But the withdrawal of the mounted army from the Southern Front, its departure from Lvov, virtually meant the retreat of our forces on the Southern Front as well. This wrecker's order issued by Trotsky thus forced upon our troops on the Southern Front an incomprehensible and absolutely unjustified retreat, to the joy of the Polish gentry. This was giving direct assistance, indeed, not to our Western Front, however, but to the Polish gentry in the Entente. Within a few days the advance of the Poles was checked and our troops began preparations for a new counter-offensive. But, unable to continue the war, and alarmed by the prospect of a Red counter-offensive, Poland was obliged to renounce her claims to the Ukrainian territory west of the Dnieper and to Byelorussia and preferred to conclude peace. On October 20, 1920, the Peace of Riga was signed. In accordance with this treaty, Poland retained Galicia and part of Byelorussia. Having concluded peace with Poland, the Soviet Republic decided to put an end to Wrangel. The British and French had supplied him with guns, rifles, armored cars, tanks, aeroplanes and ammunition of the latest type. He had White Guard shock regiments, mainly consisting of officers. But Wrangel failed to rally any considerable number of peasants and Cossacks in support of the troops he had landed in the Kuban and the Don regions. Nevertheless, he advanced to the very gates of the Donets Basin, creating a menace to our coal region. The position of the Soviet government at that time was further complicated by the fact that the Red Army was suffering greatly from fatigue. The troops were obliged to advance under extremely difficult conditions. While conducting an offensive against Wrangel, they had at the same time to smash Makhno's anarchist bands who were assisting Wrangel. Sula and there bottled him up. In November 1920, the Red forces captured the fortified position of Perekop, swept into the Crimea, smashed Wrangel's forces and cleared the peninsula of the White Guards and the forces of intervention. The Crimea became Soviet territory. The failure of Poland's imperialist plans and the defeat of Wrangel ended the period of intervention. At the end of 1920 there began the liberation of Transcaucasia. Azerbaijan was freed from the yoke of the bourgeois nationalist Musavatists, Georgia from the Menshevik nationalists, and Armenia from the Dashniks. The Soviet power triumphed in Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia. This did not yet mean the end of all intervention. That of the Japanese in the Far East lasted until 1922. Moreover, new attempts at intervention were made. Ataman Semyonov and Baron Ungern in the east, the Finnish Whites in Karelia in 1921. But the principal enemies of the Soviet country, the principal forces of intervention, were shattered by the end of 1920. The war of the foreign interventionists and the Russian White Guards against the Soviets ended in a victory for the Soviets. The Soviet Republic preserved its independence and freedom. This was the end of foreign military intervention and civil war. This was a historic victory for the Soviet power. 5. How and why the Soviet Republic defeated the combined forces of British, French, Japanese, Polish intervention and of the bourgeois landlord White Guard. Counter-revolution in Russia. If we study the leading European and American newspapers and periodicals of the period of intervention, we shall easily find that there was not a single prominent writer, military or civilian, not a single military expert who believed that the Soviet government could win. On the contrary, all prominent writers, military experts and historians of revolution of all countries and nations, all the so-called savants, were unanimous in declaring that the days of the Soviets were numbered, that their defeat was inevitable. They based their certainty of the victory of the forces of intervention on the fact that whereas Soviet Russia had no organized army and had to create its Red Army under fire, so to speak, the interventionists and White Guards did have an army more or less ready to hand. Further, they based their certainty on the fact that the Red Army had no experienced military men, the majority of them having gone over to the counter-revolution, whereas the interventionists and White Guards did have such men. Furthermore, they based their certainty on the fact that, owing to the backwardness of Russia's war industry, the Red Army was suffering from a shortage of arms and ammunition, that what it did have was of poor quality, while it could not obtain supplies from abroad because Russia was hermetically sealed on all sides by the blockade. The army of the interventionists and White Guards, on the other hand, was abundantly supplied, and would continue to be supplied, with first-class arms, ammunition and equipment. Lastly, they based their certainty on the fact that the army of the interventionists and White Guards occupied the richest food-producing regions of Russia, whereas the Red Army had no such regions and was suffering from a shortage of provisions. And it was a fact that the Red Army did suffer from all these handicaps and deficiencies. In this respect, but only in this respect, the gentlemen of the intervention were absolutely right. How then is it to be explained that the Red Army, although suffering from such grave shortcomings, was able to defeat the army of the interventionists and White Guards which did not suffer from such shortcomings? 1. The Red Army was victorious because the Soviet government's policy for which the Red Army was fighting was a right policy, one that corresponded to the interests of the people, and because the people understood and realized that it was the right policy, their own policy, and supported it unreservedly. The Bolsheviks knew that an army that fights for a wrong policy, for a policy that is not supported by the people, cannot win. The army of the interventionists and White Guards was such an army. It had everything. Experienced commanders and first-class arms, ammunition, equipment and provisions. It lacked only one thing: the support and sympathy of the peoples of Russia, for the peoples of Russia could not and would not support the policy of the interventionists and White Guard rulers, because it was a policy hostile to the people. And so the interventionist and White Guard army was defeated. 2. The Red Army was victorious because it was absolutely loyal and faithful to its people, for which reason the people loved and supported it and looked upon it as their own army. The Red Army is the offspring of the people, and if it is faithful to its people, as a true son is to his mother, it will have the support of the people and is bound to win. An army, however, that goes against its people must suffer defeat. 3. The Red Army was victorious because the Soviet government was able to muster the whole rear, the whole country, to serve the needs of the front. An army without a strong rear to support the front in every way is doomed to defeat. The Bolsheviks knew this, and that is why they converted the country into an armed camp to supply the front with arms, ammunition, equipment, food and reinforcements. 4. The Red Army was victorious because a. The Red Army men understood the aims and purposes of the war and recognized their justice. b. The recognition of the justice of the aims and purposes of the war strengthened their discipline and fighting efficiency, and c. As a result, the Red Army throughout displayed unparalleled self-sacrifice and unexampled mass heroism in battle against the enemy. 5. The Red Army was victorious because its leading corps, both at the front and in the rear, was the Bolshevik Party, united in its solidarity and discipline, strong in its revolutionary spirit and readiness for any sacrifice in the common cause, and unsurpassed in its ability to organize millions and to lead them properly in complex situations. It is only because of the party's vigilance and its strict discipline, said Lenin, because the authority of the party united all government departments and institutions, because the slogans issued by the Central Committee were followed by tens, hundreds, thousands and finally millions of people as one man, because incredible sacrifices were made, that the miracle took place and we were able to win, in spite of repeated campaigns of the imperialists of the Entente and of the whole world. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 25, page 96. 6. The Red Army was victorious because a. It was able to produce from its own ranks military commanders of a new type, men like Franz Voroshilov, Budyonny, and others. b. In its ranks fought such talented heroes who came from the people as Kotovsky, Chapayev, Lazo, Shores, Parkhomenko, and many others. c. The political education of the Red Army was in the hands of men like Lenin, Stalin, Molotov, Kalinin, Sverdlov, Kaganovich, Orjonikidze, Kirov, Kuibyshev, Mikoyan, Zhdanov, Andreev, Petrovsky, Yaroslavsky, Yezhov, Dzerzhinsky, Shchedenko, Mekles, Khrushchev, Shvernik, Shkariatov, and others. d. The Red Army possessed such outstanding organizers and agitators as the military commissars, who by their work cemented the ranks of the Red Army men, fostered in them the spirit of discipline and military daring, and energetically, swiftly and relentlessly, cut short the treacherous activities of certain of the commanders, while on the other hand, they boldly and resolutely supported the prestige and renown of commanders, party and non-party, who had proved their loyalty to the Soviet power and who were capable of leading the Red Army units with a firm hand. Without the military commissars we would not have had a Red Army, Lenin said. 7. The Red Army was victorious because in the rear of the White Armies, in the rear of Kolchak, Denikin, Krasnov and Wrangel, there secretly operated splendid Bolsheviks, party and non-party, who raised the workers and peasants in revolt against the invaders, against the White Guards, undermined the rear of the foes of the Soviet government, and thereby facilitated the advance of the Red Army. Everybody knows that the partisans of the Ukraine, Siberia, the Far East, the Urals, Byelorussia and the Volga region, by undermining the rear of the White Guards and the invaders, rendered invaluable service to the Red Army. 8. The Red Army was victorious because the Soviet Republic was not alone in its struggle against White Guard counter-revolution and foreign intervention, because the struggle of the Soviet government and its successes enlisted the sympathy and support of the proletarians of the whole world. While the imperialists were trying to stifle the Soviet Republic by intervention and blockade, the workers of the imperialist countries sided with the Soviets and helped them. Their struggle against the capitalists of the countries hostile to the Soviet Republic helped in the end to force the imperialists to call off the intervention. The workers of Great Britain, France and the other intervening powers called strikes, refused to load munitions consigned to the invaders and the White Guard generals, and set up councils of action whose work was guided by the slogan, "Hands off Russia. The international bourgeoisie has only to raise its hand against us to have it seized by its own workers," Lenin said. Ibid. Page 405. BRIEFSUMMARY. Vanquished by the October Revolution, the landlords and capitalists, in conjunction with the White Guard generals, conspired with the governments of the Entente countries against the interests of their own country for a joint armed attack on the Soviet land and for the overthrow of the Soviet government. This formed the basis of the military intervention of the Entente and of the White Guard revolts in the border. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution regions of Russia, as a result of which Russia was cut off from her sources of food and raw material. The military defeat of Germany and the termination of the war between the two imperialist coalitions in Europe served to strengthen the Entente and to intensify the intervention, and created new difficulties for Soviet Russia. On the other hand, the revolution in Germany and the incipient revolutionary movement in the European countries created favorable international conditions for the Soviet power and relieved the position of the Soviet Republic. The Bolshevik Party roused the workers and peasants for a war for the fatherland, a war against the foreign invaders and the bourgeois and landlord White Guards. The Soviet Republic and its Red Army defeated one after another the puppets of the Entente, Kolchak, Yudenik, Denikin, Krasnov and Wrangel, drove out of the Ukraine and Byelorussia another puppet of the Entente, Pilsudski, and thus beat off the forces of foreign intervention and drove them out of the Soviet country. Thus the first armed attack of international capital on the land of socialism ended in a complete fiasco. In the period of intervention, the parties which had been smashed by the revolution, the socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, anarchists and nationalists, supported the White Guard generals and the invaders, hatched counter-revolutionary plots against the Soviet Republic and resorted to terrorism against Soviet leaders. These parties, which had enjoyed a certain amount of influence among the working class before the October Revolution, completely exposed themselves before the masses as counter-revolutionary parties during the Civil War. The period of civil war and intervention witnessed the political collapse of these parties and the final triumph of the Communist Party in Soviet Russia. CHAPTERNINE. The Bolshevik Party in the period of transition to the peaceful work of economic restoration. 1921-1925. 1. Soviet Republic after the defeat of the intervention and end of the Civil War. Difficulties of the restoration period having ended the war, the Soviet Republic turned to the work of peaceful economic development. The wounds of war had to be healed. The shattered economic life of the country had to be rebuilt, its industry, railways and agriculture restored. But the work of peaceful development had to be undertaken in extremely difficult circumstances. The victory in the Civil War had not been an easy one. The country had been reduced to a state of ruin by 4 years of imperialist war and 3 years of war against the intervention. The gross output of agriculture in 1920 was only about one-half of the pre-war output, that of the poverty-stricken Russian countryside of Tsarist days. To make matters worse, in 1920 there was a harvest failure in many of the provinces. Agriculture was in sore straits. Even worse was the plight of industry, which was in a state of complete dislocation. The output of large-scale industry in 1920 was a little over 1/7 of pre-war. Most of the mills and factories were at a standstill, mines and collieries were wrecked and flooded. Gravest of all was the condition of the iron and steel industry. The total output of pig iron in 1921 was only 116,300 tons, or about 3% of the pre-war output. There was a shortage of fuel. Transport was disrupted. Stocks of metal and textiles in the country were nearly exhausted. There was an acute shortage of such prime necessities as bread, fats, meat, footwear, clothing, matches, salt, kerosene, and soap. While the war was on, people put up with the shortage and scarcity, and were sometimes even oblivious to it. But now that the war was over, they suddenly felt that this shortage and scarcity were intolerable and began to demand that they be immediately remedied. Discontent appeared among the peasants. The fire of the Civil War 248 had welded and steeled a military and political alliance of the working class and the peasantry. This alliance rested on a definite basis. The peasants received from the Soviet government land and protection against the landlords and kulaks. The workers received from the peasantry foodstuffs under the surplus appropriation system. Now this basis was no longer adequate. The Soviet state had been compelled to appropriate all surplus produce from the peasants for the needs of national defense. Victory in the Civil War would have been impossible without the surplus appropriation system, without the policy of war communism. This policy was necessitated by the war and intervention. As long as the war was on, the peasantry had acquiesced in the surplus appropriation system and had paid no heed to the shortage of commodities. But when the war ended and there was no longer any danger of the landlords returning, the peasants began to express dissatisfaction with having to surrender all their surpluses with the surplus appropriation system and to demand a sufficient supply of commodities. As Lenin pointed out, the whole system of war communism had come into collision with the interests of the peasantry. The spirit of discontent affected the working class as well. The proletariat had borne the brunt of the Civil War, had heroically and self-sacrificingly fought the White Guard and foreign hordes, and the ravages of economic disruption and famine. The best, the most class-conscious, self-sacrificing and disciplined workers were inspired by socialist enthusiasm. But the utter economic disruption had its influence on the working class, too. The few factories and plants still in operation were working spasmodically. The workers were reduced to doing odd jobs for a living, making cigarette lighters and engaging in petty bartering for food in the villages, bag trading. The class basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat was being weakened. The workers were scattering, decamping for the villages, ceasing to be workers and becoming declassed. Some of the workers were beginning to show signs of discontent owing to hunger and weariness. The party was confronted with the necessity of working out a new line of policy on all questions affecting the economic life of the country, a line that would meet the new situation. And the party proceeded to work out such a line of policy on questions of economic development. But the class enemy was not dozing. He tried to exploit the distressing economic situation and the discontent of the peasants for his own purposes. Illusionaries broke out in Siberia, the Ukraine and the Tambov province, Antonov's rebellion. All kinds of counter-revolutionary elements. Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, white guards, bourgeois nationalists, became active again. The enemy adopted new tactics of struggle against the Soviet power. He began to borrow a Soviet garb, and his slogan was no longer the old bankrupt, down with the Soviets, but a new slogan, for the Soviets, but without communists. A glaring instance of the new tactics of the class enemy was the counter-revolutionary mutiny in Kronstadt. It began in March 1921, a week before the 10th Party Congress. White Guards, in complicity with socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks and representatives of foreign states, assumed the lead of the mutiny. The mutineers at first used a Soviet signboard to camouflage their purpose of restoring the power and property of the capitalists and landlords. They raised the cry, "Soviets without communists." The counter-revolutionaries tried to exploit the discontent of the petty bourgeois masses in order to overthrow the power of the Soviets under a pseudo-Soviet slogan. Two circumstances facilitated the outbreak of the Kronstadt mutiny: the deterioration in the composition of the ship's crews, and the weakness of the Bolshevik organization in Kronstadt. Nearly all the old sailors who had taken part in the October Revolution were at the front, heroically fighting in the ranks of the Red Army. The naval replenishments consisted of new men, who had not been schooled in the revolution. These were a perfectly raw peasant mass who gave expression to the peasantry's discontent with the surplus appropriation system. As for the Bolshevik organization in Kronstadt, it had been greatly weakened by a series of mobilizations for the front. This enabled the socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks and White Guards to worm their way into Kronstadt and to seize control of it. The mutineers gained possession of a first-class fortress, the fleet, and a vast quantity of arms and ammunition. The international counter-revolutionaries were triumphant. But their jubilation was premature. The mutiny was quickly put down by Soviet troops. Against the Kronstadt mutineers the party sent its finest sons, delegates to the 10th Congress, headed by Comrade Voroshilov. The Red Army men advanced on Kronstadt across a thin sheet of ice. It broke in places and many were drowned. The almost impregnable forts of Kronstadt had to be taken by storm. But loyalty to the revolution, bravery and readiness to die for the Soviets won the day. The fortress of Kronstadt fell before the onslaught of the Red troops. The Kronstadt mutiny was suppressed. 2. Party discussion on the trade unions, 10th Party. Congress. Defeat of the opposition. Adoption of the new economic policy, NEP. The Central Committee of the party, its Leninist majority, saw clearly that now that the war was over and the country had turned to peaceful economic development, there was no longer any reason for maintaining the rigid regime of war communism, the product of war and blockade. The Central Committee realized that the need for the surplus appropriation system had passed, that it was time to supersede it by a tax in kind so as to enable the peasants to use the greater part of their surpluses at their own discretion. The Central Committee realized that this measure would make it possible to revive agriculture, to extend the cultivation of grain and industrial crops required for the development of industry, to revive the circulation of commodities, to improve supplies to the towns, and to create a new foundation, an economic foundation for the alliance of workers and peasants. The Central Committee realized also that the prime task was to revive industry, but considered that this could not be done without enlisting the support of the working class and its trade unions. It considered that the workers could be enlisted in this work by showing them that the economic disruption was just as dangerous an enemy of the people as the intervention in the blockade had been, and that the party and the trade unions could certainly succeed in this work if they exercised their influence on the working class not by military commands, as had been the case at the front, where commands were really essential, but by methods of persuasion, by convincing it. But not all members of the party were of the same mind as the Central Committee. The small opposition groups, the Trotskyites, workers' opposition, left communists, democratic centralists, etc., wavered and vacillated in face of the difficulties attending the transition to peaceful economic construction. There were in the party quite a number of ex-members of the Menshevik, Socialist Revolutionary, Bund and Borodist parties, and all kinds of semi-nationalists from the border regions of Russia. Most of them allied themselves with one opposition group or another. These people were not real Marxists, they were ignorant of the laws of economic development, and had not had a Leninist party schooling, and they only helped to aggravate the confusion and vacillations of the opposition groups. Some of them thought that it would be wrong to relax the rigid regime of war communism, that, on the contrary, the screws must be tightened. Others thought that the party and the state should stand aside from the economic restoration, and that it should be left entirely in the hands of the trade unions. It was clear that with such confusion reigning among certain groups in the party, lovers of controversy, opposition, leaders, of one kind or another were bound to try to force a discussion upon the party. And that is just what happened. The discussion started over the role of the trade unions, although the trade unions were not the chief problem of party policy at the time. It was Trotsky who started the discussion and the fight against Lenin, against the Leninist majority of the Central Committee. With the intention of aggravating the situation, he came out at a meeting of communist delegates to the Fifth All-Russian Trade Union Conference, held at the beginning of November 1920, with the dubious slogans of tightening the screws and shaking up the trade unions. Trotsky demanded that the trade unions be immediately governmentalized. He was against the use of persuasion in relations with the working class, and was in favor of introducing military methods in the trade unions. Trotsky was against any extension of democracy in the trade unions, against the principle of electing trade union bodies. Instead of methods of persuasion, without which the activities of working class organizations are inconceivable, the Trotskyites proposed methods of sheer compulsion, of dictation. Applying this policy wherever they happened to occupy leading positions in the trade unions, the Trotskyites caused conflicts, disunity and demoralization in the unions. By their policy the Trotskyites were setting the mass of the non-party workers against the party, were splitting the working class. As a matter of fact, the discussion on the trade unions was of much broader import than the trade union question. As was stated later in the resolution of the plenum of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, adopted on January 17, 1925, the actual point at issue was the policy to be adopted towards the peasantry, who were rising against war communism, the policy to be adopted towards the mass of the non-party workers, and, in general, what was to be the approach of the party to the masses in the period when the Civil War was coming to an end. Resolutions of the CPSU, B. Russ ed. Part 1, page 651. Trotsky's lead was followed by other anti-party groups, the Workers' Opposition, Shlapnikov, Medvedev, Kollontai and others, the Democratic Centralists, Sapronov, Drobnis, Bogoslavsky, Osinsky, V. Smirnov and others, the Left Communists, Bukharin, Preobrazhensky. The Workers' Opposition put forward a slogan demanding that the administration of the entire national economy be entrusted to an All-Russian Producers' Congress. They wanted to reduce the role of the party to naught, and denied the importance of the dictatorship of the proletariat to economic development. The Workers' Opposition contended that the interests of the trade unions were opposed to those of the Soviet state and the Communist Party. They held that the trade unions, and not the party, were the highest form of working-class organization. The workers' opposition was essentially an anarcho-syndicalist anti-party group. The democratic centralists, Desists, demanded complete freedom for factions and groupings. Like the Trotskyites, the democratic centralists tried to undermine the leadership of the party in the Soviets and in the trade unions. Lenin spoke of the democratic centralists as a faction of champion shouters, and of their platform as a socialist revolutionary Menshevik platform. Trotsky was assisted in his fight against Lenin and the party by Bukharin. With Preobrazhensky, Serebryakov and Sokolnikov, Bukharin formed a buffer group. This group defended and shielded the Trotskyites, the most vicious of all factionalists. Lenin said that Bukharin's behavior was the acme of ideological depravity. Very soon, the Bukharinites openly joined forces with the Trotskyites against Lenin. Lenin and the Leninists concentrated their fire on the Trotskyites as the backbone of the anti-party groupings. They condemned the Trotskyites for ignoring the difference between trade unions and military bodies and warned them that military methods could not be applied to the trade unions. Lenin and the Leninists drew up a platform of their own, entirely contrary in spirit to the platforms of the opposition groups. In this platform, the trade unions were defined as a school of administration, a school of management, a school of communism. The trade unions should base all their activities on methods of persuasion. Only then would the trade unions rouse the workers as a whole to combat the economic disruption and be able to enlist them in the work of socialist construction. In this fight against the opposition groupings, the party organizations rallied around Lenin. The struggle took an especially acute form in Moscow. Here the opposition concentrated its main forces, with the object of capturing the party organization of the capital. But these factionalist intrigues were frustrated by the spirited resistance of the Moscow Bolsheviks. An acute struggle broke out in the Ukrainian party organizations as well. Led by Comrade Molotov, then the secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Ukraine, the Ukrainian Bolsheviks routed the Trotskyites and Shlapnikovites. The Communist Party of the Ukraine remained a loyal support of Lenin's party. In Baku, the routing of the opposition was led by Comrade Ordzhonikidze. In Central Asia, the fight against the anti-party groupings were headed by Comrade L. Kaganovich. All the important local organizations of the party endorsed Lenin's platform. On March 8, 1921, the 10th Party Congress opened. The Congress was attended by 694 delegates with vote, representing 732,521 party members, and 296 delegates with voice but no vote. The Congress summed up the discussion on the trade unions and endorsed Lenin's platform by an overwhelming majority. In opening the Congress, Lenin said that the discussion had been an inexcusable luxury. He declared that the enemies had speculated on the inter-party strife and on a split in the ranks of the Communist Party. Realizing how extremely dangerous the existence of factional groups was to the Bolshevik Party and the dictatorship of the proletariat, the 10th Congress paid special attention to party unity. The report on this question was made by Lenin. The Congress passed condemnation on all the opposition groups and declared that they were, in fact, helping the class enemies of the proletarian revolution. The Congress ordered the immediate dissolution of all factional groups and instructed all party organizations to keep a strict watch to prevent any outbreaks of factionalism, non-observance of the Congress decision to be followed by unconditional and immediate expulsion from the party. The Congress authorized the Central Committee, in the event of members of that body violating discipline, or reviving or tolerating factionalism, to apply to them all party penalties, including expulsion from the Central Committee and from the party. These decisions were embodied in a special resolution on party unity, moved by Lenin and adopted by the Congress. In this resolution, the Congress reminded all party members that unity and solidarity of the ranks of the party, unanimity of will of the vanguard of the proletariat were particularly essential at that juncture, when a number of circumstances had, during the time of the 10th Congress, increased the vacillation among the petty bourgeois population of the country. Notwithstanding this, read the resolution, even before the general party discussion on the trade unions, certain signs of factionalism had been apparent in the party, viz. the formation of groups with separate platforms, striving to a certain degree to segregate and create their own group discipline. All class-conscious workers must clearly realize the perniciousness and impermissibility of factionalism of any kind, for in practice factionalism inevitably results in weakening teamwork. At the same time it inevitably leads to intensified and repeated attempts by the enemies of the party, who have fastened themselves onto it because it is the governing party, to widen the cleavage in the party, and to use it for counter-revolutionary purposes. Further, in the same resolution, the Congress said, "The way the enemies of the proletariat take advantage of every deviation from the thoroughly consistent communist line was most strikingly shown in the case of the Kronstadt Mutiny, when the bourgeois counter-revolutionaries and white guards in all countries of the world immediately expressed their readiness to accept even the slogans of the Soviet system, if only they might thereby secure the overthrow of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia, and when the socialist revolutionaries and the bourgeois counter-revolutionaries in general resorted in Kronstadt to slogans calling for an insurrection against the Soviet government of Russia ostensibly in the interest of Soviet power. These facts fully prove that the white guards strive, and are able to disguise themselves as communists, and even as people, more left, than the communists, solely for the purpose of weakening and overthrowing the bulwark of the proletarian revolution in Russia. Menshevik leaflets distributed in Petrograd on the eve of the Kronstadt mutiny likewise show how the Mensheviks took advantage of the disagreements in the RCP actually in order to egg on and support the Kronstadt mutineers, the socialist revolutionaries and white guards, while claiming to be opponents of mutiny and supporters of the Soviet power, only with supposedly slight modifications. The resolution declared that in its propaganda the party must explain in detail the harm and danger of factionalism to party unity and to the unity of purpose of the vanguard of the proletariat, which is a fundamental condition for the success of the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the other hand, the Congress resolution stated, the party must explain in its propaganda the peculiarity of the latest tactical methods employed by the enemies of the Soviet power. These enemies, read the resolution, having realized the hopelessness of counter-revolution under an openly white guard flag, are now doing their utmost to utilize the disagreements within the RCP. And to further the counter-revolution in one way or another by transferring the power to the political groupings which outwardly are closest to the recognition of the Soviet power. Resolutions of the CPSU, B. Rus. ed. Part 1, pp. 373-74. The resolution further stated that in its propaganda the party must also teach the lessons of preceding revolutions in which the counter-revolutionaries usually supported the petty bourgeois groupings which stood closest to the extreme revolutionary party, in order to undermine and overthrow the revolutionary dictatorship, and thus pave the way for the subsequent complete victory of the counter-revolution, of the capitalists and landlords. Closely allied to the resolution on party unity was the resolution on the syndicalist and anarchist deviation in our party, also moved by Lenin and adopted by the Congress. In this resolution, the 10th Congress passed condemnation on the so-called workers' opposition. The Congress declared that the propaganda of the ideas of the anarcho-syndicalist deviation was incompatible with membership in the Communist Party, and called upon the party vigorously to combat this deviation. The 10th Congress passed the highly important decision to replace the surplus appropriation system by a tax in kind, to adopt the new economic policy, NEP. This turn from war communism to NEP is a striking instance of the wisdom and farsightedness of Lenin's policy. The resolution of the Congress dealt with the substitution of a tax in kind for the surplus appropriation system. The tax in kind was to be lighter than the assessments under the surplus appropriation system. The total amount of the tax was to be announced each year before the spring sowing. The dates of delivery under the tax were to be strictly specified. All produce over and above the amount of the tax was to be entirely at the disposal of the peasant, who would be at liberty to sell these surpluses at will. In his speech, Lenin said that freedom of trade would at first lead to a certain revival of capitalism in the country. It would be necessary to permit private trade and to allow private manufacturers to open small businesses. But no fears need be entertained on this score. Lenin considered that a certain freedom of trade would give the peasant an economic incentive, induce him to produce more, and would lead to a rapid improvement of agriculture. That, on this basis, the state-owned industries would be restored and private capital displaced. That strength and resources having been accumulated, a powerful industry could be created as the economic foundation of socialism, and that then a determined offensive could be undertaken to destroy the remnants of capitalism in the country. War communism had been an attempt to take the fortress of the capitalist elements in town and countryside by assault, by a frontal attack. In this offensive the party had gone too far ahead, and ran the risk of being cut off from its base. Now Lenin proposed to retire a little, to retreat for a while nearer to the base, to change from an assault of the fortress to the slower method of siege, so as to gather strength and resume the offensive. The Trotskyites and other oppositionists held that NEP was nothing but a retreat. This interpretation suited their purpose, for their line was to restore capitalism. This was a most harmful, anti-Leninist interpretation of NEP. The fact is that only a year after NEP was introduced, Lenin declared at the 11th Party Congress that the retreat had come to an end, and he put forward the slogan, "Prepare for an offensive on private capital." Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 27, page 213. The oppositionists, poor Marxists and crass ignoramuses in questions of Bolshevik policy as they were, understood neither the meaning of NEP nor the character of the retreat undertaken at the beginning of NEP. We have dealt with the meaning of NEP above. As for the character of the retreat, there are retreats and retreats. There are times when a party or an army has to retreat because it has suffered defeat. In such cases, the army or party retreats to preserve itself and its ranks for new battles. It was no such retreat that Lenin proposed when NEP was introduced, because, far from having suffered defeat or discomfiture, the party had itself defeated the interventionists and White Guards in the Civil War. But there are other times, when in its advance a victorious party or army runs too far ahead, without providing itself with an adequate base in the rear. This creates a serious danger. So as not to lose connection with its base, an experienced party or army generally finds it necessary in such cases to fall back a little, to draw closer to and establish better contact with its base, in order to provide itself with. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution all it needs, and then resume the offensive more confidently and with guarantee of success. It was this kind of temporary retreat that Lenin effected by the new economic policy. Reporting to the Fourth Congress of the Communist International on the reasons that prompted the introduction of NEP, Lenin plainly said, "In our economic offensive we ran too far ahead, we did not provide ourselves with an adequate base, and so it was necessary to make a temporary retreat to a secure rear." The misfortune of the opposition was that, in their ignorance, they did not understand, and never understood to the end of their days, this feature of the retreat under NEP. The decision of the 10th Congress on the new economic policy ensured a durable economic alliance of the working class and the peasantry for the building of socialism. This prime object was served by yet another decision of the Congress, the decision on the national question. The report on the national question was made by Comrade Stalin. He said that we had abolished national oppression, but that this was not enough. The task was to do away with the evil heritage of the past, the economic, political and cultural backwardness of the formerly oppressed peoples. They had to be helped to catch up with Central Russia. Comrade Stalin further referred to two anti-party deviations on the national question: dominant nation, Great Russian, chauvinism and local nationalism. The Congress condemned both deviations as harmful and dangerous to communism and proletarian internationalism. At the same time, it directed its main blow at the bigger danger, dominant nation chauvinism, i.e., the survivals and hangovers of the attitude towards the nationalities such as the Great Russian chauvinists had displayed towards the non-Russian peoples under TSRDM. 3. First results of NEP. 11th Party Congress. Formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Lenin's illness. Lenin's cooperative plan. 12th Party Congress. The new economic policy was resisted by the unstable elements in the party. The resistance came from two quarters. First there were the left shouters, political freaks like Lomonadze, Shatskin and others, who argued that NEP meant a renunciation of the gains of the October Revolution, a return to capitalism, the downfall of the Soviet power. Because of their political illiteracy and ignorance of the laws of economic development, these people did not understand the policy of the party, fell into a panic, and sowed dejection and discouragement. Then there were the downright capitulators, like Trotsky, Radek, Zinoviev, Sokolnikov, Kamenev, Shlapnikov, Bukharin, Rykov and others, who did not believe that the socialist development of our country was possible, bowed before the omnipotence of capitalism and, in their endeavor to strengthen the position of capitalism in the Soviet country, demanded far-reaching concessions to private capital, both home and foreign, and the surrender of a number of key positions of the Soviet power in the economic field to private capitalists, the latter to act either as concessionaries or as partners of the state in mixed joint stock companies. Both groups were alien to Marxism and Leninism. Both were exposed and isolated by the party, which passed severe stricture on the alarmists and the capitulators. This resistance to the party policy was one more reminder that the party needed to be purged of unstable elements. Accordingly, the Central Committee in 1921 organized a party purge, which helped to considerably strengthen the party. The purging was done at open meetings, in the presence and with the participation of non-party people. Lenin advised that the party be thoroughly cleansed of rascals, bureaucrats, dishonest or wavering communists, and of Mensheviks who have repainted their facade, but who have remained Mensheviks at heart. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ, ed., Volume 27, page 13. Altogether, nearly 170,000 persons, or about 25% of the total membership, were expelled from the party as a result of the purge. The purge greatly strengthened the party, improved its social composition, increased the confidence of the masses in it, and heightened its prestige. The party became more closely welded and better disciplined. The correctness of the new economic policy was proved in its very first year. Its adoption served greatly to strengthen the alliance of workers and peasants on a new basis. The dictatorship of the proletariat gained in might and strength. Kulak banditry was almost completely liquidated. The middle peasants, now that the surplus appropriation system had been abolished, helped the Soviet government to fight the Kulak bands. The Soviet government retained all the key positions in the economic field: large-scale industry, the means of transport, the banks, the land, and home and foreign trade. The party achieved a definite turn for the better on the economic front. Agriculture soon began to forge ahead. Industry and the railways could record their first successes. An economic revival began, still very slow but sure. The workers and the peasants felt and perceived that the party was on the right track. In March 1922, the party held its 11th Congress. It was attended by 522 voting delegates, representing 532,000 party members, which was less than at the previous Congress. There were 165 delegates with voice but no vote. The reduction in the membership was due to the party purge which had already begun. At this Congress the party reviewed the results of the first year of the new economic policy. These results entitled Lenin to declare at the Congress, "For a year we have been retreating. In the name of the party we must now call a halt. The purpose pursued by the retreat has been achieved. This period is drawing, or has drawn, to a close. Now our purpose is different, to regroup our forces." Ibid. Page 238. Lenin said that NEP meant a life and death struggle between capitalism and socialism. Who will win? That was the question. In order that we might win, the bond between the working class and the peasantry, between socialist industry and peasant agriculture, had to be made secure by developing the exchange of goods between town and country to the utmost. For this purpose the art of management and of efficient trading would have to be learned. At that period, trade was the main link in the chain of problems that confronted the party. Unless this problem were solved it would be impossible to develop the exchange of goods between town and country, to strengthen the economic alliance between the workers and peasants, impossible to advance agriculture, or to extricate industry from its state of disruption. Soviet trade at that time was still very undeveloped. The machinery of trade was highly inadequate. Communists had not yet learned the art of trade. They had not studied the enemy, the Nepman, or learned how to combat him. The private traders, or Nepman, had taken advantage of the undeveloped state of Soviet trade to capture the trade in textiles and other goods in general demand. The organization of state and cooperative trade became a matter of utmost importance. After the 11th Congress, work in the economic sphere was resumed with redoubled vigor. The effects of the recent harvest failure were successfully remedied. Peasant farming showed rapid recovery. The railways began to work better. Increasing numbers of factories and plants resumed operation. In October 1922, the Soviet Republic celebrated a great victory. Vladivostok, the last piece of Soviet territory to remain in the hands of the invaders, was wrested by the Red Army and the Far Eastern Partisan from the hands of the Japanese. The whole territory of the Soviet Republic having been cleared of interventionists, and the needs of socialist construction and national defense demanding a further consolidation of the union of the Soviet peoples, the necessity now arose of welding the Soviet republics closer together in a single federal state. All the forces of the people had to be combined for the work of building socialism. The country had to be made impregnable. Conditions had to be created for the all-round development of every nationality in our country. This required that all the Soviet nations should be brought into still closer union. In December 1922 the first All-Union Congress of Soviets was held, at which, on the proposal of Lenin and Stalin, a voluntary state union of the Soviet nations was formed, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Originally, the USSR comprised the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, TSFSR, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, UKR, SSR, and the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, BSSR. Somewhat later, three independent Union Soviet republics, the Uzbek, Turkmen and Tajik, were formed in Central Asia. All these republics have now united in a single union of Soviet states, the USSR, on a voluntary and equal basis, each of them being reserved the right of freely seceding from the Soviet Union. The formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics meant the consolidation of the Soviet power and a great victory for the Leninist-Stalinist policy of the Bolshevik Party on the national question. In November 1922, Lenin made a speech at a plenary meeting of the Moscow Soviet in which he reviewed the 5 years of Soviet rule and expressed the firm conviction that NEP Russia will become socialist Russia. This was his last speech to the country. That same autumn a great misfortune overtook the party. Lenin fell seriously ill. His illness was a deep and personal affliction to the whole party and to all the working people. All lived in trepidation for the life of their beloved Lenin. But even in illness Lenin did not discontinue his work. When already a very sick man, he wrote a number of highly important articles. In these last writings he reviewed the work already performed and outlined a plan for the building of socialism in our country by enlisting the peasantry in the cause of socialist construction. This contained his cooperative plan for securing the participation of the peasantry in the work of building socialism. Operative societies in particular, as a means of transition, a means within the reach and understanding of the peasant millions, from small, individual farming to large-scale producing associations, or collective farms. Lenin pointed out that the line to be followed in the development of agriculture in our country was to draw the peasants into the work of building socialism through the cooperative societies, gradually to introduce the collective principle in agriculture, first in the selling, and then in the growing of farm produce. With the dictatorship of the proletariat and the alliance of the working class and the peasantry, with the leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat made secure, and with the existence of a socialist industry, Lenin said, a properly organized producing cooperative system embracing millions of peasants was the means whereby a complete socialist society could be built in our country. In April 1923, the party held its 12th Congress. Since the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks, this was the first Congress at which Lenin was unable to be present. The Congress was attended by 408 voting delegates, representing 386,000 party members. This was less than was represented at the previous Congress, the reduction being due to the fact that in the interval the party purge had continued and had resulted in the expulsion of a considerable percentage of the party membership. There were 417 delegates with voice but no vote. The 12th Party Congress embodied in its decisions the recommendations made by Lenin in his recent articles and letters. The Congress sharply rebuked those who took NEP to mean a retreat from the socialist position, a surrender to capitalism, and who advocated a return to capitalist bondage. Proposals of this kind were made at the Congress by Roddick and Krasin, followers of Trotsky. They proposed that we should throw ourselves on the tender mercies of foreign capitalists, surrender to them, in the form of concessions, branches of industry that were of vital necessity to the Soviet state. They proposed that we pay the Tsarist government's debts annulled by the October Revolution. The party stigmatized these capitulatory proposals as treachery. It did not reject the policy of granting concessions, but favored it only in such industries and in such dimensions as would be of advantage to the Soviet state. Bukharin and Sokolnikov had even prior to the Congress proposed the abolition of the state monopoly of foreign trade. The proposal was also based on the conception that NEP was a surrender to capitalism. Lenin had branded Bukharin as a champion of the profiteers, Nepman and kulaks. The 12th Congress firmly repelled the attempts to undermine the monopoly of foreign trade. The Congress also repelled Trotsky's attempt to foist upon the party a policy towards the peasantry that would have been fatal, and stated that the predominance of small peasant farming in the country was a fact not to be forgotten. It emphatically declared that the development of industry, including heavy industry, must not run counter to the interests of the peasant masses, but must be based on a close bond with the peasants, in the interests of the whole working population. These decisions were an answer to Trotsky, who had proposed that we should build up our industry by exploiting the peasants, and who in fact did not accept the policy of an alliance of the proletariat with the peasantry. At the same time, Trotsky had proposed that big plants like the Putilov, Bryansk and others, which were of importance to the country's defense, should be closed down allegedly on the grounds that they were unprofitable. The Congress indignantly rejected Trotsky's proposals. On Lenin's proposal, sent to the Congress in written form, the 12th Congress united the Central Control Commission of the party and the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection into one body. To this united body were entrusted the important duties of safeguarding the unity of our party, strengthening party and civil discipline, and improving the Soviet state apparatus in every way. An important item on the agenda of the Congress was the national question, the report on which was made by Comrade Stalin. Comrade Stalin stressed the international significance of our policy on the national question. To the oppressed peoples in the East and West, the Soviet Union was a model of the solution of the national question and the abolition of national oppression. He pointed out that energetic measures were needed to put an end to economic and cultural inequality among the peoples of the Soviet Union. He called upon the party to put up a determined fight against deviations in the national question, great Russian chauvinism and local bourgeois nationalism. The nationalist deviators and their dominant nation policy towards the national minorities were exposed at the Congress. At that time the Georgian nationalist deviators, Mdivani and others, were opposing the party. They had been against the formation of the Transcaucasian Federation and were against the promotion of friendship between the peoples of Transcaucasia. The deviators were behaving like outright dominant nation chauvinists towards the other nationalities of Georgia. They were expelling non-Georgians from Tiflis wholesale, especially Armenians. They had passed a law under which Georgian women who married non-Georgians lost their Georgian citizenship. The Georgian nationalist deviators were supported by Trotsky, Roddick, Bukharin, Skripnik and Rakovsky. Shortly after the Congress, a special conference of party workers from the national republics was called to discuss the national question. Here were exposed a group of Tatar bourgeois nationalists, Sultan Galiev and others, and a group of Uzbek nationalist deviators, Faizullah Kajayev and others. The 12th Party Congress reviewed the results of the new economic policy for the past 2 years. They were very heartening results and inspired confidence in ultimate victory. Our party has remained solid and united. It has stood the test of a momentous turn, and is marching on with flying colors. Comrade Stalin declared at the Congress. 4. Struggle against the difficulties of economic restoration. Trotskyites take advantage of Lenin's illness to increase their activity. New party discussion. Defeat of the Trotskyites. Death of Lenin. The Lenin enrollment. 13th Party Congress. The struggle to restore the national economy yielded substantial results in its very first year. By 1924, progress was to be observed in all fields. The crop area had increased considerably since 1921, and peasant farming was steadily improving. Socialist industry was growing and expanding. The working class had greatly increased in numbers. Wages had risen. Life had become easier and better for the workers and peasants as compared with 1920 and 1921. But the effects of the economic disruption still made themselves felt. Industry was still below the pre-war level, and its development was still far behind the country's demand. At the end of 1923, there were about 1 million unemployed. The national economy was progressing too slowly to absorb unemployment. The development of trade was being hindered by the excessive prices of manufactured goods, prices which the Nepman and the Nepman elements in our trading organizations were imposing on the country. Owing to this, the Soviet ruble began to fluctuate violently and to fall in value. These factors impeded the improvement of the condition of the workers and peasants. In the autumn of 1923, the economic difficulties were somewhat aggravated owing to violations of the Soviet price policy by our industrial and commercial organizations. There was a yawning gap between the prices of manufactures and the prices of farm produce. Grain prices were low, while prices of manufacturers were inordinately high. Industry was burdened with excessive overhead costs which increased the price of goods. The money which the peasants received for their grain rapidly depreciated. To make matters worse, the Trotskyite Pyatakov, who was at that time on the Supreme Council of National Economy, gave managers and directors criminal instructions to grind all the profit they could out of the sale of manufactured goods and to force up prices to the maximum, ostensibly for the purpose of developing industry. As a matter of fact, this Nepman policy could only narrow the base of industry and undermine it. It became unprofitable for the peasantry to purchase manufactured goods, and they stopped buying them. The result was a sales crisis, from which industry suffered. Difficulties arose in the payment of wages. This provoked discontent among the workers. At some factories, the more backward workers stopped work. The Central Committee of the party adopted measures to remove these difficulties and anomalies. Steps were taken to overcome the sales crisis. Prices of consumers' goods were reduced. It was decided to reform the currency and to adopt a firm and stable currency unit, the chevonts. The normal payment of wages was resumed. Measures were outlined for the development of trade through state and cooperative channels and for the elimination of private traders and profiteers. What was now required was that everybody should join in the common effort, roll up his sleeves, and set to work with gusto. That is the way all who were loyal to the party thought and acted. But not so the Trotskyites. They took advantage of the absence of Lenin, who was incapacitated by grave illness, to launch a new attack on the party and its leadership. They decided that this was a favorable moment to smash the party and overthrow its leadership. They used everything they could as a weapon against the party: the defeat of the revolution in Germany and Bulgaria in the autumn of 1923, the economic difficulties at home, and Lenin's illness. It was at this moment of difficulty for the Soviet state, when the party's leader was stricken by sickness, that Trotsky started his attack on the Bolshevik party. He mustered all the anti-Leninist elements in the party and concocted an opposition platform against the party, its leadership, and its policy. This platform was called the Declaration of the 46 Oppositionists. All the opposition groupings, the Trotskyites, Democratic Centralists, and the remnants of the left communist and workers' opposition groups, united to fight the Leninist party. In their declaration, they prophesied a grave economic crisis and the fall of the Soviet power, and demanded freedom of factions and groups as the only way out of the situation. This was a fight for the restoration of factionalism which the 10th Party Congress, on Lenin's proposal, had prohibited. The Trotskyites did not make a single definite proposal for the improvement of agriculture or industry, for the improvement of the circulation of commodities, or for the betterment of the condition of the working people. This did not even interest them. The only thing that interested them was to take advantage of Lenin's absence in order to restore factions within the party, to undermine its foundations and its Central Committee. The platform of the 46 was followed up by the publication of a letter by Trotsky in which he vilified the party cadres and leveled new slanderous accusations against the party. In this letter Trotsky harped on the old Menshevik themes which the party had heard from him many times before. First of all, the Trotskyites attacked the party apparatus. They knew that without a strong apparatus the party could not live and function. The opposition tried to undermine and destroy the party apparatus, to set the party members against it, and the young members against the old stalwarts of the party. In this letter Trotsky played up to the students, the young party members who were not acquainted with the history of the party's fight against Trotskyism. To win the support of the students, Trotsky flatteringly referred to them as the party's surest barometer, at the same time declaring that the Leninist old guard had degenerated. Alluding to the degeneration of the leaders of the Second International, he made the foul insinuation that the old Bolshevik guard was going the same way. By this outcry about the degeneration of the party, Trotsky tried to hide his own degeneration in his anti-party scheming. The Trotskyites circulated both oppositionist documents, viz. the platform of the 46 and Trotsky's letter, in the districts and among the party nuclei and put them up for discussion by the party membership. They challenged the party to a discussion. Thus the Trotskyites forced a general discussion on the party, just as they did at the time of the controversy over the trade union question before the 10th Party Congress. Although the party was occupied with the far more important problems of the country's economic life, it accepted the challenge and opened the discussion. The whole party was involved in the discussion. The fight took a most bitter form. It was fiercest of all in Moscow, for the Trotskyites endeavored above all to capture the party organization in the capital. But the discussion was of no help to the Trotskyites. It only disgraced them. They were completely routed both in Moscow and all other parts of the Soviet Union. Only a small number of nuclei in universities and offices voted for the Trotskyites. In January 1924 the party held its 13th conference. The conference heard a report by Comrade Stalin, summing up the results of the discussion. The conference condemned the Trotskyite opposition, declaring that it was a petty bourgeois deviation from Marxism. The decisions of the conference were subsequently endorsed by the 13th Party Congress and the 5th Congress of the Communist International. The International Communist Proletariat supported the Bolshevik Party in its fight against Trotskyism. But the Trotskyites did not cease their subversive work. In the autumn of 1924, Trotsky published an article entitled, "The Lessons of October," in which he attempted to substitute Trotskyism for Leninism. It was a sheer slander on our party and its leader, Lenin. This defamatory broadsheet was seized upon by all enemies of communism and of the Soviet government. The party was outraged by this unscrupulous distortion of the heroic history of Bolshevism. Comrade Stalin denounced Trotsky's attempt to substitute Trotskyism for Leninism. He declared that, "It is the duty of the party to bury Trotskyism as an ideological trend." An effective contribution to the ideological defeat of Trotskyism and to the defense of Leninism was Comrade Stalin's theoretical work, Foundations of Leninism, published in 1924. This book is a masterly exposition and a weighty theoretical substantiation of Leninism. It was, and is today, a trenchant weapon of Marxist-Leninist theory in the hands of Bolsheviks all over the world. In the battles against Trotskyism, Comrade Stalin rallied the party around its Central Committee and mobilized it to carry on the fight for the victory of socialism in our country. Comrade Stalin proved that Trotskyism had to be ideologically demolished if the further victorious advance to socialism was to be ensured. Reviewing this period of the fight against Trotskyism, Comrade Stalin said, "Unless Trotskyism is defeated, it will be impossible to achieve victory under the conditions of NEP, it will be impossible to convert present-day Russia into a socialist Russia." But the successes attending the party's Leninist policy were clouded by a most grievous calamity which now befell the party and the working class. On January 21, 1924, Lenin, our leader and teacher, the creator of the Bolshevik Party, passed away in the village of Gorky, near Moscow. Lenin's death was received by the working class of the whole world as a most cruel loss. On the day of Lenin's funeral, the international proletariat proclaimed a 5-minute stoppage of work. Railways, mills and factories came to a standstill. As Lenin was borne to the grave, the working people of the whole world paid homage to him in overwhelming sorrow, as to a father and teacher, their best friend and defender. The loss of Lenin caused the working class of the Soviet Union to rally even more solidly around the Leninist Party. In those days of mourning, every class-conscious worker defined his attitude to the Communist Party, the executor of Lenin's behest. The Central Committee of the party received thousands upon thousands of applications from workers for admission to the party. The Central Committee responded to this movement and proclaimed a mass admission of politically advanced workers into the party ranks. Tens of thousands of workers flocked into the party. They were people prepared to give their lives for the cause of the party, the cause of Lenin. In a brief space of time, over 240,000 workers joined the ranks of the Bolshevik Party. They were the foremost section of the working class, the most class-conscious and revolutionary, the most intrepid and disciplined. This was the Lenin enrollment. The reaction to Lenin's death demonstrated how close are our party's ties with the masses, and how high a place the Leninist Party holds in the hearts of the workers. In the days of mourning for Lenin, at the Second Congress of Soviets of the USSR, Comrade Stalin made a solemn vow in the name of the party. He said, "We communists are people of a special mold. We are made of a special stuff. We are those who form the army of the great proletarian strategist, the army of Comrade Lenin. There is nothing higher than the honor of belonging to this army. There is nothing higher than the title of member of the party whose founder and leader is Comrade Lenin. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to hold high and guard the purity of the great title of member of the party. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will fulfill your behest with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to guard the unity of our party as the apple of our eye. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest, too, we will fulfill with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to guard and strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will spare no effort to fulfill this behest, too, with honor. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to strengthen with all our might the alliance of the workers and the peasants. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest, too, we will fulfill with honor. Comrade Lenin untiringly urged upon us the necessity of maintaining the voluntary union of the nations of our country, the necessity for fraternal cooperation between them within the framework of the Union of Republics. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to consolidate and extend the Union of Republics. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that this behest, too, we will fulfill with honor. More than once did Lenin point out to us that the strengthening of the Red Army and the improvement of its condition is one of the most important tasks of our party. Let us vow then, comrades, that we will spare no effort to strengthen our Red Army and our Red Navy. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin adjured us to remain faithful to the principles of the Communist International. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will not spare our lives to strengthen and extend the union of the toilers of the whole world, the Communist International, Joseph Stalin, the Lenin heritage. This was the vow made by the Bolshevik Party to its leader, Lenin, whose memory will live throughout the ages. In May 1924 the party held its 13th Congress. It was attended by 748 voting delegates, representing a party membership of 735,881. This marked increase in membership in comparison with the previous Congress was due to the admission of some 250,000 new members under the Lenin enrollment. There were 416 delegates with voice but no vote. The Congress unanimously condemned the platform of the Trotskyite opposition, defining it as a petty bourgeois deviation from Marxism, as a revision of Leninism, and endorsed the resolutions of the 13th Party Conference on Party Affairs, and the results of the discussion. With the purpose of strengthening the bond between town and country, the Congress gave instructions for a further expansion of industry, primarily of the light industries, while placing particular stress on the necessity for a rapid development of the iron and steel industry. The Congress endorsed the formation of the People's Commissariat of Internal Trade and set the trading bodies the task of gaining control of the market and ousting private capital from the sphere of trade. The Congress gave instructions for the increase of cheap state credit to the peasantry so as to oust the usurer from the countryside. The Congress called for the maximum development of the cooperative movement among the peasantry as the paramount task in the countryside. Lastly, the Congress stressed the profound importance of the Lenin enrollment and drew the party's attention to the necessity of devoting greater efforts to educating the young party members, and above all the recruits of the Lenin enrollment, in the principles of Leninism. 5. The Soviet Union towards the end of the Restoration. Period. The question of socialist construction and the victory of socialism in our country. ZINOVIEVKAMENEV. New Opposition. 14th Party Congress. Policy of socialist industrialization of the country. For over 4 years the Bolshevik Party and the working class had been working strenuously along the lines of the new economic policy. The heroic work of economic restoration was approaching completion. The economic and political might of the Soviet Union was steadily growing. By this time the international situation had undergone a change. Capitalism had withstood the first revolutionary onslaught of the masses after the imperialist war. The revolutionary movement in Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Poland and a number of other countries had been crushed. The bourgeoisie had been aided in this by the leaders of the compromising social democratic parties. A temporary ebb in the tide of revolution set in. There began a temporary, partial stabilization of capitalism in Western Europe, a partial consolidation of the position of capitalism. But the stabilization of capitalism did not eliminate the basic contradictions rending capitalist society. On the contrary, the partial, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution stabilization of capitalism aggravated the contradictions between the workers and the capitalists, between imperialism and the colonial nations, between the imperialist groups of the various countries. The stabilization of capitalism was preparing for a new explosion of contradictions, for new crises in the capitalist countries. Parallel with the stabilization of capitalism, proceeded the stabilization of the Soviet Union. But these two processes of stabilization were fundamentally different in character. Capitalist stabilization presaged a new crisis of capitalism. The stabilization of the Soviet Union meant a further growth of the economic and political might of the socialist country. Despite the defeat of the revolution in the West, the position of the Soviet Union in the international arena continued to grow stronger, although, it is true, at a slower rate. In 1922, the Soviet Union had been invited to an international economic conference in Genoa, Italy. At the Genoa conference, the imperialist governments, emboldened by the defeat of the revolution in the capitalist countries, tried to bring new pressure to bear on the Soviet Republic, this time in diplomatic form. The imperialists presented brazen demands to the Soviet Republic. They demanded that the factories and plants which had been nationalized by the October Revolution be returned to the foreign capitalists. They demanded the payment of the debts of the Tsarist government. In return, the imperialist states promised some trifling loans to the Soviet government. The Soviet Union rejected these demands. The Genoa conference was barren of result. The threat of a new intervention contained in the ultimatum of Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, in 1923, also met with the rebuff it deserved. Having tested the strength of the Soviet government and convinced themselves of its stability, the capitalist states began one after another to resume diplomatic relations with our country. In 1924, diplomatic relations were restored with Great Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. It was plain that the Soviet Union had been able to win a prolonged breathing space, a period of peace. The domestic situation had also changed. The self-sacrificing efforts of the workers and peasants, led by the Bolshevik Party, had borne fruit. The rapid development of the national economy was manifest. In the fiscal year 1924-25, agricultural output had already approached the pre-war level, amounting to 87% of the pre-war output. In 1925, the large-scale industries of the USSR were already producing about 3/4 of the pre-war industrial output. In the fiscal year 1924-25, the Soviet Union was able to invest 385 million rubles in capital construction work. The plan for the electrification of the country was proceeding successfully. Socialism was consolidating its key positions in the national economy. Important successes had been won in the struggle against private capital in industry and trade. Economic progress was accompanied by a further improvement in the condition of the workers and peasants. The working class was growing rapidly. Wages had risen, and so had productivity of labor. The standard of living of the peasants had greatly improved. In 1924-25, the workers and peasants government was able to assign nearly 290 million rubles for the purpose of assisting the small peasants. The improvement in the condition of the workers and peasants led to greater political activity on the part of the masses. The dictatorship of the proletariat was now more firmly established. The prestige and influence of the Bolshevik Party had grown. The restoration of the national economy was approaching completion. But mere economic restoration, the mere attainment of the pre-war level, was not enough for the Soviet Union, the land of socialism in construction. The pre-war level was the level of a backward country. The advance had to be continued beyond that point. The prolonged breathing space gained by the Soviet state ensured the possibility of further development. But this raised the question in all its urgency. What were to be the perspectives, the character of our development, of our construction? What was to be the destiny of socialism in the Soviet Union? In what direction was economic development in the Soviet Union to be carried on, in the direction of socialism, or in some other direction? Should we and could we build a socialist economic system, or were we fated but to manure the soil for another economic system, the capitalist economic system? Was it possible at all to build a socialist economic system in the USSR, and, if so, could it be built in spite of the delay of the revolution in the capitalist countries, in spite of the stabilization of capitalism? Was it at all possible to build a socialist economic system by way of the new economic policy, which, while it was strengthening and augmenting the forces of socialism in the country in every way, nevertheless still promoted a certain growth of capitalism? How was a socialist economic system to be constructed? From which end should its construction begin? All these questions confronted the party towards the end of the Restoration period, and no longer as theoretical questions, but as practical questions, as questions of everyday economic policy. All these questions needed straightforward and plain answers, so that our party members engaged in the development of industry and agriculture, as well as the people generally, might know in what direction to work, towards socialism or towards capitalism. Unless plain answers were given to these questions, all our practical work of construction would be without perspective, work in the dark, labor in vain. The party gave plain and definite answers to all these questions. Yes, replied the party, a socialist economic system could be and should be built in our country, for we had everything needed for the building of a socialist economic system, for the building of a complete socialist society. In October 1917, the working class had vanquished capitalism politically, by establishing its own political dictatorship. Since then, the Soviet government had been taking every measure to shatter the economic power of capitalism and to create conditions for the building of a socialist economic system. These measures were the expropriation of the capitalists and landlords, the conversion of the land, factories, mills, railways and the banks into public property, the adoption of the new economic policy, the building up of a state-owned socialist industry, and the application of Lenin's cooperative plan. Now the main task was to proceed to build a new, socialist economic system all over the country and thus smash capitalism economically as well. All our practical work, all our actions must be made to serve this main purpose. The working class could do it and would do it. The realization of this colossal task must begin with the industrialization of the country. The socialist industrialization of the country was the chief link in the chain. With it, the construction of a socialist economic system must begin. Neither the delay of the revolution in the West, nor the partial stabilization of capitalism in the non-Soviet countries could stop our advance to socialism. The new economic policy could only make this task easier, for it had been introduced by the party with the specific purpose of facilitating the laying of a socialist foundation for our economic system. Such was the party's answer to the question, was the victory of socialist construction possible in our country? But the party knew that the problem of the victory of socialism in one country did not end there. The construction of socialism in the Soviet Union would be a momentous turning point in the history of mankind, a victory for the working class and peasantry of the USSR, marking a new epoch in the history of the world. Yet this was an internal affair of the USSR and was only a part of the problem of the victory of socialism. The other part of the problem was its international aspect. In substantiating the thesis that socialism could be victorious in one country, Comrade Stalin had repeatedly pointed out that the question should be viewed from two aspects, the domestic and the international. As for the domestic aspect of the question, i.e., the class relations within the country, the working class and the peasantry of the USSR were fully capable of vanquishing their own bourgeoisie economically and building a complete socialist society. But there was also the international aspect of the question, namely, the sphere of foreign relations, the sphere of the relations between the Soviet Union and the capitalist countries, between the Soviet people and the international bourgeoisie, which hated the Soviet system and was seeking the chance to start again armed intervention in the Soviet Union, to make new attempts to restore capitalism in the USSR. And since the USSR was as yet the only socialist country, all the other countries remaining capitalist, the USSR continued to be encircled by a capitalist world, which gave rise to the danger of capitalist intervention. Clearly, there would be a danger of capitalist intervention as long as this capitalist encirclement existed. Could the Soviet people by their own efforts destroy this external danger, the danger of capitalist intervention in the USSR? No, they could not. They could not, because in order to destroy the danger of capitalist intervention, the capitalist encirclement would have to be destroyed. And the capitalist encirclement could be destroyed only as a result of victorious proletarian revolutions in at least several countries. It followed from this that the victory of socialism in the USSR, as expressed in the abolition of the capitalist economic system and the building of a socialist economic system, could not be considered a final victory, inasmuch as the danger of foreign armed intervention and of attempts to restore capitalism had not been eliminated, and inasmuch as the socialist country had no guarantee against this danger. To destroy the danger of foreign capitalist intervention, the capitalist encirclement would have to be destroyed. Of course, as long as the Soviet government pursued a correct policy, the Soviet people and their Red Army would be able to beat off a new foreign capitalist intervention just as they had beaten off the first capitalist intervention of 1918-20. But this would not mean that the danger of new capitalist intervention would be eliminated. The defeat of the first intervention did not destroy the danger of new intervention. Inasmuch as the source of the danger of intervention, the capitalist encirclement, continued to exist. Neither would the danger of intervention be destroyed by the defeat of the new intervention if the capitalist encirclement continued to exist. It followed from this that the victory of the proletarian revolution in the capitalist countries was a matter of vital concern to the working people of the USSR. Such was the party's line on the question of the victory of socialism in our country. The Central Committee demanded that this line be discussed at the forthcoming 14th Party Conference, and that it be endorsed and accepted as the line of the party, as a party law, binding upon all party members. This line of the party came as a thunderbolt to the oppositionists, above all, because the party lent it a specific and practical character, linked it with a practical plan for the socialist industrialization of the country, and demanded that it be formulated as a party law, as a resolution of the 14th Party Conference, binding upon all party members. The Trotskyites opposed this party line and set up against it the Menshevik theory of permanent revolution, which it would be an insult to Marxism to call a Marxist theory, and which denied the possibility of the victory of socialist construction in the USSR. The Bukharinites did not venture to oppose the party line outspokenly, but they furtively set up against it their own theory of the peaceful growing of the bourgeoisie into socialism, amplifying it with a new slogan, "Get rich." According to the Bukharinites, the victory of socialism meant fostering and encircling the bourgeoisie, not destroying it. Zinoviev and Kamenev ventured forth with the assertion that the victory of socialism in the USSR was impossible because of the country's technical and economic backwardness, but they soon found it prudent to hide under cover. The 14th Party Conference, April 1925, condemned all these capitulatory theories of the open and covert oppositionists and affirmed the party line of working for the victory of socialism in the USSR, adopting a resolution to this effect. Driven to the wall, Zinoviev and Kamenev preferred to vote for this resolution. But the party knew that they had only postponed their struggle and had decided to give battle to the party at the 14th Party Congress. They were mustering a following in Leningrad and forming the so-called new opposition. The 14th Party Congress opened in December 1925. The situation within the party was tense and strained. Never in its history had there been a case when the whole delegation from an important party center like Leningrad had prepared to come out in opposition to their central committee. The Congress was attended by 665 delegates with vote and 641 with voice but no vote, representing 643,000 party members and 445,000 candidate members, or a little less than at the previous Congress. The reduction was due to a partial purge, a purge of the party organizations in universities and offices to which anti-party elements had gained entrance. The political report of the Central Committee was made by Comrade Stalin. He drew a vivid picture of the growth of the political and economic might of the Soviet Union. Thanks to the advantages of the Soviet economic system, both industry and agriculture had been restored in a comparatively short space of time and were approaching the pre-war level. But good as these results were, Comrade Stalin proposed that we should not rest there, for they could not nullify the fact that our country still remained a backward, agrarian country. 2/3 of the total production of the country was provided by agriculture and only 1/3 by industry. Comrade Stalin said that the party was now squarely confronted with the problem of converting our country into an industrial country, economically independent of capitalist countries. This could be done, and must be done. It was now the cardinal task of the party to fight for the socialist industrialization of the country, for the victory of socialism. The conversion of our country from an agrarian into an industrial country able to produce the machinery it needs by its own efforts. That is the essence, the basis of our general line, said Comrade Stalin. The industrialization of the country would ensure its economic independence, strengthen its power of defense and create the conditions for the victory of socialism in the USSR. The Zinovievites opposed the general line of the party. As against Stalin's plan of socialist industrialization, the Zinovievite Sokolnikov put forward a bourgeois plan, one that was then in vogue among the imperialist sharks. According to this plan, the USSR was to remain an agrarian country, chiefly producing raw materials and foodstuffs, exporting them, and importing machinery, which it did not and should not produce itself. As conditions were in 1925, this was tantamount to a plan for the economic enslavement of the USSR by the industrially developed foreign countries, a plan for the perpetuation of the industrial backwardness of the USSR for the benefit of the imperialist sharks of the capitalist countries. The adoption of this plan would have converted our country into an impotent agrarian, agricultural appendage of the capitalist world. It would have left it weak and defenseless against the surrounding capitalist world, and in the end would have been fatal to the cause of socialism in the USSR. The Congress condemned the economic plan of the Zinovievites as a plan for the enslavement of the USSR. Equally unsuccessful were the other sorties of the new opposition, as, for instance, when they asserted, in defiance of Lenin, that our state industries were not socialist industries, or when they declared, again in defiance of Lenin, that the middle peasant could not be an ally of the working class in the work of socialist construction. The Congress condemned these sorties of the new opposition as anti-Leninist. Comrade Stalin laid bare the Trotskyite Menshevik essence of the new opposition. He showed that Zinoviev and Kamenev were only harping on the old tunes of the enemies of the party with whom Lenin had waged so relentless a struggle. It was clear that the Zinovievites were nothing but ill-disguised Trotskyites. Comrade Stalin stressed the point that the main task of our party was to maintain a firm alliance between the working class and the middle peasant in the work of building socialism. He pointed to two deviations on the peasant question existing in the party at that time, both of which constituted a menace to this alliance. The first deviation was the one that underestimated and belittled the kulak danger. The second was the one that stood in panic fear of the kulak and underestimated the role of the middle peasant. To the question, which deviation was worse? Comrade Stalin replied, one is as bad as the other. And if these deviations are allowed to develop, they may disintegrate and destroy the party. Fortunately, there are forces in our party capable of ridding it of both deviations. And the party did indeed rout both deviations, the left and the right, and rid itself of them. Summing up the debate on the question of economic development, the 14th Party Congress unanimously rejected the capitulatory plans of the oppositionists and recorded in its now famous resolution. In the sphere of economic development, the Congress holds that in our land, the land of the dictatorship of the proletariat, there is every requisite for the building of a complete socialist society. Lenin. The Congress considers that the main task of our party is to fight for the victory of socialist construction in the USSR. The 14th Party Congress adopted new party rules. Since the 14th Congress, our party has been called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, the CPSU, B. Though defeated at the Congress, the Zinovievites did not submit to the party. They started a fight against the decisions of the 14th Congress. Immediately following the Congress, Zinoviev called a meeting of the Leningrad Provincial Committee of the Young Communist League, the leading group of which had been reared by Zinoviev, Zalutsky, Bakayev, Yevdokimov, Kuklin, Safarov and other double dealers in a spirit of hatred of the Leninist Central Committee of the party. At this meeting, the Leningrad Provincial Committee passed a resolution unparalleled in the history of the YCL. It refused to abide by the decisions of the 14th Party Congress. But the Zinovievite leaders of the Leningrad YCL did not in any way reflect the mind of the mass of young communist leaguers of Leningrad. They were therefore easily defeated, and soon the Leningrad organization recovered the place in the YCL to which it was entitled. Towards the close of the 14th Congress, a group of Congress delegates, comrades Molotov, Kirov, Voroshilov, Kalinin, Andreev and others, were sent to Leningrad to explain to the members of the Leningrad Party organization the criminal, anti-Bolshevik nature of the stand taken up at the Congress by the Leningrad delegation, who had secured their mandates under false pretenses. The meetings at which the reports on the Congress were made were marked by stormy scenes. An extraordinary conference of the Leningrad Party organization was called. The overwhelming majority of the party members of Leningrad, over 97%, fully endorsed the decisions of the 14th Party Congress and condemned the anti-party Zinovievite, new opposition. The latter already at that time were generals without an army. The Leningrad Bolsheviks remained in the front ranks of the party of Lenin-Stalin. Summing up the results of the 14th Party Congress, Comrade Stalin wrote, "The historical significance of the 14th Congress of the CPSU lies in the fact that it was able to expose the very roots of the mistakes of the new opposition, that it spurned their skepticism and sniveling, that it clearly and distinctly indicated the path of the further struggle for socialism, opened before the party the prospect of victory, and thus armed the proletariat with an invincible faith in the victory of socialist construction." Stalin. Leninism, Volume I, page 319. BRIEFSUMMARY. The years of transition to the peaceful work of economic restoration constituted one of the most crucial periods in the history of the Bolshevik Party. In a tense situation, the party was able to effect the difficult turn from the policy of war communism to the new economic policy. The party reinforced the alliance of the workers and peasants on a new economic foundation. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed. By means of the new economic policy, decisive results were obtained in the restoration of the economic life of the country. The Soviet Union emerged from the period of economic restoration with success and entered a new period, the period of industrialization of the country. The transition from civil war to peaceful socialist construction was accompanied by great difficulties, especially in the early stages. The enemies of Bolshevism, the anti-party elements in the ranks of the CPSU, waged a desperate struggle against the Leninist party all through this period. These anti-party elements were headed by Trotsky. His henchmen in this struggle were Kamenev, Zinoviev and Bukharin. After the death of Lenin, the oppositionists calculated on demoralizing the ranks of the Bolshevik party, on splitting the party, and infecting it with disbelief in the possibility of the victory of socialism in the USSR. In point of fact, the Trotskyites were trying to form another party in the USSR, a political organization of the new bourgeoisie, a party of capitalist restoration. The party rallied under the banner of Lenin around its Leninist Central Committee, around Comrade Stalin, and inflicted defeat both on the Trotskyites and on their new friends in Leningrad, the Zinoviev-Kamenev new opposition. Having accumulated strength and resources, the Bolshevik Party brought the country to a new stage in its history, the stage of socialist industrialization.